My grandmother kept a small, worn Bible on the table beside her bed. She had read it so many times that certain pages had gone soft at the edges, and the ones she returned to most, I noticed this as a child, were the pages of Samuel. Not Revelation, not Genesis, Samuel. I never understood why until I was much older, and I sat down and actually read those chapters without rushing, without skipping ahead, the way she must have read them. And what stopped me was not the wars, not the giant, not the throne. What stopped me was a single sentence buried in the opening of 1 Samuel chapter 16, so understated you could miss it entirely. The prophet Samuel arrives in Bethlehem. Jesse lines up his sons, and when David is finally called in from the fields, the youngest, the one nobody thought to send for, the text simply says he was ruddy, with beautiful eyes, and was handsome. That is all it gives you. No prophecy explaining why. No fanfare. Just a young man who smelled of the outdoors, walking into a room that was about to change the direction of an entire civilization. What I want to sit with in this documentary is the distance between that field and that throne, because that distance is not a short one, and it is not a clean one either. Scholars who work outside of devotional tradition tend to pull no punches about what the archaeological record actually says. The Tel Dan Stele, a fragmentary Aramaic stone inscription unearthed in northern Israel in 1993 by archaeologist Avraham Byron and his team at Tel Dan, is the earliest known extra-biblical confirmation of the House of David in the physical historical record. It dates to roughly the 9th century BCE. She written by an Aramean king who references his military victories over the king of Israel and the king of the House of David. That inscription is real. It exists. It sits in the Israel Museum in Jerusalem, and what it tells us is not that it confirms every detail of the Samuel narrative. It does not. But that within a century of David's reign, the dynasty he founded was real enough, powerful enough, and established enough that foreign kings were putting its defeat on stone monuments as a matter of pride. You do not carve your victories over legends. You carve them over dynasties. Then there is the Bethlehem question. The scholar Stephen Mackenzie of Rhodes College, who wrote what many consider one of the more rigorously critical biographies of David, makes an argument that pulls apart the familiar myth of the poor shepherd boy from the surrounding landscape of the text. Jesse, David's father, was not a subsistence farmer, scraping by in the Judean hills. He was a man of standing in Bethlehem, an elder, with significant holdings of land and livestock. The kind of man whose youngest son could afford to spend years developing the particular, intimate, dangerous skills of a shepherd, not because the family had nothing, but because someone had to do it, and the youngest always drew the short straw. Shepherding in the Iron Age. Judean highlands was not pastoral. It was brutal, isolated work, carried out on limestone terrain, where predators were real, and where the only tool between a boy and a lion was nerve and a sling he had spent years learning to use with precision. The text tells us David killed both a lion and a bear before Goliath ever stepped onto a valley floor. I believe that detail because it is not the kind of detail you invent if you are trying to make someone sound heroic. It is too ordinary, too matter-of-fact. It reads like a man listing his credentials. What the distance from Bethlehem to Jerusalem cost David is something the biblical writers are, surprisingly to modern readers, remarkably honest about. The same man who wrote psalms of such raw anguish and tenderness that they are still being read aloud in hospital rooms 3,000 years later is also the man who sent Uriah the Hittite to the front lines to die so that he could keep Bathsheba and hide what he had done. The same man who wept so completely for his murdered son, Absalom, that his general Joab had to march into the palace and physically shame him back into governance, is the man who, according to Mackenzie's reading of the political subtext, likely played a far more calculating hand in his own rise to power than the biblical narrative directly admits. He was both, entirely. And I find that more compelling than a saint's biography, because it means something about what grace actually has to work with. David died around 970 BCE, was buried in Jerusalem, and his dynasty held the throne of Judah for more than 400 years after him, an unbroken line that the New Testament follows all the way to a stable in Bethlehem, which is where this story, in a way, begins and ends in the same town. As you settle in tonight, I want you to let this one move slowly through you. The story of David is not a story about getting what you want. It is a story about being shaped by what you survive. The fields, the fugitive years, the failures, the favor. And if something in it lands differently for you tonight than it ever has before, share this documentary with someone who needs to hear it. That is the best thing you can do for what we are building here. Settle in for a moment and let me take you back, far back, to a time before Jerusalem was a holy city, before psalms were sung in royal courts, before the name David meant anything at all to anyone. I want you to picture the ancient land of Canaan, a narrow strip of earth between the Mediterranean Sea and the desert, where small tribes of people called Israel were trying to hold themselves together against forces far greater than themselves. The world they lived in was rough, unpredictable, and often violent. These were not people living in golden palaces with armies at their command. They were farmers and herders, tent dwellers and village elders, people whose identity was wrapped up entirely in their covenant with a God they believed had chosen them. And for a long time, a very long time, that covenant relationship was the only kind of leadership they had. What we are about to explore together is the world that existed before David, because you cannot truly understand the shepherd boy who became a king without first understanding the broken and restless world that was waiting for him. The ancient writers who gave us the books of Samuel were writing during what historians call the Iron Age, roughly the period around 1050 BCE in the ancient Near East. This was a world recovering from enormous disruption. Scholars and archaeologists have traced what they call the Late Bronze Age collapse, a catastrophic unraveling of civilizations across the Eastern Mediterranean that happened around 1200 BCE, toppling great empires and leaving smaller peoples scrambling for stability. The Egyptians, the Hittites, the Mycenaeans, great powers that had defined the world for centuries, were all weakened or destroyed within just a few generations. Into that vacuum, new groups pushed forward, including a confederation of peoples the biblical text calls the Philistines, who settled along the southwestern coast of Canaan and brought with them superior iron weaponry and military organization. For the tribes of Israel, this was not an abstract political shift. It was an immediate, frightening, lived reality. They faced enemies who were better armed, better organized, and pressing in from multiple directions. And their own structure of leadership, a loose arrangement of tribal judges who arose in times of crisis and then faded, was simply not keeping pace with the threat. This is exactly the moment when we open the 8th chapter of 1 Samuel, and I find it one of the most humanly honest scenes in all of ancient literature. The elders of Israel come to Samuel, who was both a prophet and the last of the great judges, and they say something remarkably direct. They say, in 1 Samuel chapter 8 and verse 5, "You are old, and your sons do not follow your ways. Now appoint a king to lead us. such as all the other nations have. Think about that request for a moment. They are not asking for something exotic or foreign. They are looking at the world around them, at the organized kingdoms of their neighbors, and concluding that what they need is exactly that. Samuel, the text tells us, was deeply displeased. He brought the matter before God, and God's response is one of the most theologically striking lines in the entire Hebrew Bible. God says to Samuel in verse 7, "It is not you they have rejected, but they have rejected me as their king." God was not absent from this conversation. He was grieved by it. And what God does next tells us something important about the kind of God the biblical writers believed in. Rather than refusing the people outright, he grants them what they want, while making absolutely sure they understand what it will cost them. Samuel delivers what reads almost like a political warning speech, and it is recorded in 1 Samuel chapter 8, verses 10 through 18. He tells the people exactly what a king will do. The king will take your sons for his army, he says. He will take your daughters for his kitchens and his fields. He will take the best of your land, your vineyards, your olive groves, and give them to his officials. He will take 1/10 of your grain and your flocks. And then Samuel says, and this line has always struck me, you yourself will become his slaves. These are not vague warnings. They are specific, practical, and in many ways prophetic of everything that will eventually go wrong in Israel's monarchy. The people hear all of this, and their response is almost breathtaking in its stubbornness. They say, "No, we want a king over us. Then we will be like all the other nations." There is something deeply human in that reply. The desire to be normal, to fit in, to have what everyone else seems to have, even when a wise voice is telling you what it will really cost. God tells Samuel to listen to the people and give them a king, which is exactly what happens next. The man chosen to be Israel's first king is a Benjaminite named Saul, and the description we get of him in 1 Samuel chapter 9 verse 2 is almost deliberately physical. The ancient writer tells us he was an impressive young man without equal among the Israelites, a head taller than any of the others. He looked like a king, in other words. He had the physical presence that people imagined a king should have, and I think the ancient storyteller was doing something intentional here, introducing us to a man who fit all the outward expectations perfectly, precisely so that what comes later hits harder. Saul began well. There were genuine moments of courage and leadership in his early reign. He rallied the tribes. He fought enemies. He saved cities. But underneath the impressive exterior, there was something fragile. A man who was easily threatened, slow to trust, and ultimately unable to hold on to the obedience that the prophets told him was required. His decline is one of the genuine tragedies of the Hebrew Bible, and it happens slowly, in stages, like a building with a cracked foundation that takes years to finally fall. To understand where Israel stood in this period, it helps to know a little about the Philistines, because they are the force pressing against Israel from the west throughout the entire early monarchy. Archaeological excavations at sites like Tel Dan, which many scholars identify with ancient Gath, have confirmed the presence of a distinctive Philistine material culture. Their pottery, their architecture, their metalwork, all pointing to a people who came originally from across the Aegean Sea, possibly from the region of the Mycenaean Greeks. They settled in 5 major cities along the Canaanite coast: Gaza, Ashdod, Ashkelon, Gath, and Ekron. They were sophisticated, organized, and militarily formidable. The biblical text tells us in 1 Samuel chapter 13 that at one point Israel had so few iron weapons that men were going down to Philistine smiths just to sharpen their farm tools. That detail, one small sentence in the middle of a war narrative, says everything about the power imbalance that the people of Israel were living under. This is the world into which David would be born, a world where his people were outmatched, afraid, and desperately in need of something, or someone, different. Now, the tribal confederacy that preceded the monarchy is worth pausing on, because it shaped everything about how the Israelites thought about themselves and their God. The book of Judges, which precedes Samuel, describes a recurring pattern. The people fall away from their covenant. They face oppression from an enemy. They cry out to God, and God raises up a judge, a leader, to deliver them. This happened again and again with figures like Deborah, Gideon, and Samson. But these judges were not kings. They did not pass their authority to their children. They arose for a moment of crisis and then receded. The system was designed to keep Israel from looking too much like its neighbors, from concentrating too much power in any one person. By the time we reach 1 Samuel, that system had run its course. Samuel's own sons, we are told in chapter 8, verses 1 through 3, were corrupt. They accepted bribes and perverted justice. The people had a real grievance, even if their solution carried real dangers. And all of this, the corruption, the military threat, the longing for stability, is the soil in which the story of David takes root. What I find theologically striking about this opening chapter of David's world is the way God responds to the people's request. In Jewish tradition, and in many Christian theological streams, particularly the Reformed tradition, this passage is read carefully as a warning about the human tendency to replace divine authority with human institutions. God does not throw up his hands in anger. He accommodates the request while speaking honestly about its costs. There is something in that posture that I find quietly remarkable. And when we read 1 Samuel chapter 8, verse 7 again, "They have rejected me as their king," we hear the weight of that statement. The people were not choosing between two political systems. According to the text, they were choosing between two kinds of authority. Scholars like Walter Brueggemann, who spent much of his career studying the Samuel narratives, have written about how the entire arc of the monarchy in Israel is told through this lens. Human kingship is always being measured against divine kingship, and it almost always comes up short. That tension never fully resolves in the biblical text, and I think that is entirely intentional. As we sit with the world before David, I want you to hold a few things gently in your mind as we move forward. Israel was a people under pressure: military pressure from the Philistines, internal pressure from failed leadership, spiritual pressure from the temptation to be like everyone else. They had a king now, a tall and impressive man from the tribe of Benjamin. But the cracks were already there. The text is honest about this from the very beginning. The monarchy was born not from God's enthusiasm, but from God's grace in the face of human insistence. And the cost of that choice would be paid over centuries. What I love about beginning David's story here, before David even enters the picture, is that it reminds us he was not born into a perfect world waiting to receive him. He was born into a world that had already made a series of choices, and those choices had consequences that he would spend his entire life navigating. The shepherd boy who will walk into this story in the next chapter arrives not as a fairy tale hero, but as a real human being stepping into a real mess. So let the weight of this world settle around you like a quiet night, unhurried and still. Israel had asked for a king and received one. And God, with a kind of patient sadness, had said yes. Saul stood tall over the people, but the spirit that would come to rest on him would not stay. Something else was being prepared, quietly, in an obscure town in the hills of Judah, a town so small that Samuel himself would have to ask which road led to it. in Bethlehem, among the sheep and the open fields, in a family that no one was watching yet. The real answer to Israel's need was growing up, not in a palace, not in a general's tent, but in the ordinary and unhurried rhythms of a shepherd's life. As we move into our next chapter, I'll take you there, to Bethlehem, to the fields, to a boy whom even his own father did not think to call when the prophet came to visit. Let me take you to a small town, a quiet place, one that you might drive past without noticing if it were on a modern road. Bethlehem, or Beit Lechem in Hebrew, which means house of bread, sits in the hill country of Judah, a few miles south of what would one day become Jerusalem. In David's time, it was not famous. It was not strategic. It did not sit on a major trade route or command a military position. Archaeological surveys of the region place it firmly in the category of a small Judahite village during the Iron Age II period, a working community of farmers, herders, and extended families tied together by kinship and shared land. And yet this is the place the ancient story chooses. This is the place Samuel is sent to when God decides it is time to do something new in Israel. I have always found something quietly moving in that choice. Not Jerusalem, not a city of power, but a little hill town where the bread was baked fresh and the sheep knew their shepherd's voice. We know from the genealogy in the book of Ruth, chapter 4, verses 18 through 22, that David's family had roots that reached back through Boaz and Ruth, through Salmon and Nahshon, all the way to Judah, one of the 12 sons of Jacob. This is not a peripheral detail. It places David firmly within the lineage of one of Israel's most prominent tribes, the tribe from which, according to the ancient blessing of Jacob in Genesis, the ruler's scepter would one day come. David's father was a man named Jesse, and Jesse had sons, many sons. The text in 1 Samuel chapter 16 tells us that when Samuel arrived in Bethlehem under the pretense of offering a sacrifice, Jesse brought 7 of his sons before the prophet, 7, and not one of them was the one God had chosen. What I find striking is that David's own father did not even think to call him in from the fields when a prophet of God came to his house. The youngest boy, the one watching the sheep, simply was not on Jesse's radar as a candidate for anything important. And perhaps that is the point. The life of a shepherd in ancient Israel was not the romanticized image we sometimes carry, a peaceful figure in a meadow with gentle lambs. The reality, as we can piece together from historical and archaeological sources, and as David himself will later describe, was genuinely demanding and sometimes dangerous. Shepherds in the Judean hills moved their flocks across terrain that was rocky and uneven, through ravines that could shelter predators, far from villages and protection. In 1 Samuel chapter 17, verses 34 through 36, a passage we will come back to later, David will tell King Saul that he has killed both a lion and a bear while protecting his flock. He says it matter-of-factly, not as a boast, but as evidence that he knows how to fight. Roland de Vaux, the great French scholar who spent his life studying ancient Israelite institutions and daily life, wrote extensively about the shepherd's role in Israelite society. It was a position that required courage, endurance, intimate knowledge of terrain, and the ability to make fast decisions alone without anyone watching. These were exactly the qualities that would later define David as a military commander and a king. Now, we also know from the text that Jesse's household had some standing in Bethlehem. It was not a family living on the edge of poverty. When Saul later develops his court, we read in 1 Samuel chapter 17, verses 17 and 18, that Jesse sends David to the battlefield camp, not just to fight, but to bring food provisions to his brothers and to check on their welfare. He sends grain and loaves and cheese. A household that could afford to send provisions was not a destitute household. So while David's position as the youngest son placed him lowest in the social order of his own family, the family itself was not without resources or reputation. In the ancient Near Eastern world, birth order carried enormous social weight. The oldest son inherited, made decisions, represented the family. The youngest son did the tasks no one else wanted, including, apparently, watching the sheep while everyone else went to war or met with prophets. And David did this faithfully in the fields outside Bethlehem, while the events that would transform his life were building on the horizon without his knowledge. Here is what the ancient text tells us in 1 Samuel chapter 16, verses 1 through 3. God speaks to Samuel while Samuel is still grieving the failure of Saul, and God says something that must have felt both clarifying and daunting to the old prophet. How long will you mourn for Saul, since I have rejected him as king over Israel? Fill your horn with oil and be on your way. I am sending you to Jesse of Bethlehem. I have chosen one of his sons to be king. Samuel immediately raises a practical concern. If Saul hears about this, he will kill me. And God gives Samuel a cover story. Go to make a sacrifice, invite Jesse, and I will show you what to do. What strikes me about this exchange is how ordinary it feels, in a way. God does not announce his new king with trumpets or signs in the sky. He sends an old man on a road trip to a small town with a horn of oil and instructions to improvise. The whole scene has the texture of something real, cautious, human, unfolding step by step. Samuel arrives in Bethlehem, and the elders of the town meet him with visible anxiety. The text in 1 Samuel 16, verse 4, says they trembled and asked, "Do you come in peace?" A visiting prophet could mean a pronouncement of judgment. Samuel assures them he comes to make a sacrifice and invites Jesse and his sons to consecrate themselves and attend. And then the parade of sons begins. Eliab walks before Samuel first, and we are told in verse 6 that when Samuel saw him, he thought, "Surely this is the Lord's anointed." Eliab apparently looked impressive, the way Saul had looked impressive. But God stops Samuel with a line that has echoed through centuries of reflection. Do not consider his appearance or his height, for I have rejected him. The Lord does not look at the things people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. 6 more sons pass. 6 more times? The answer is no. And then Jesse is asked, almost as an afterthought, whether he has any more sons. There is still the youngest, Jesse says, but he is tending the sheep. I love that detail. They have to send someone out to get him. The chosen one is still in the field. When David finally walks in, the description in 1 Samuel 16 verse 12 is brief but vivid. He was glowing with health, with beautiful eyes and a handsome appearance. And God says to Samuel, "Rise and anoint him. This is the one." What follows is quiet and private. Samuel takes his horn of oil and pours it over David's head in front of his brothers. No crowd, no public ceremony, no announcement to the nation. Verse 13 tells us that from that day forward, the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon David. And then, and this is what I find so remarkable, life apparently went on. David went back to his sheep. Saul was still king. Nothing visible had changed. The anointing was real. The Spirit was real, but the throne was still decades and 1,000 dangers away. What God had set in motion was invisible to the world, known only to an old prophet, a father, a handful of brothers, and a boy with oil drying on his forehead in a field outside Bethlehem. The word used for what Samuel did, anointing, is the Hebrew word meshash, and it is worth pausing on it for a moment because it carries more weight than it might first appear. To anoint someone in the ancient world was to designate them, to mark them as set apart for a specific role. This practice was not unique to Israel. Historical records from Egypt, from Ugarit, from Hittite archives, all show that anointing with oil was the standard way that ancient Near Eastern societies marked kings and priests as consecrated for service. In the Israelite tradition, and this act carried the added dimension of divine election. It was not simply a human ceremony. The word mashak is also the root of the Hebrew word Mashiach, which we translate into Greek as Christos and into English as Messiah. Every time that word appears in the Hebrew Bible, every time a king is called the Lord's Anointed, it connects back to this tradition that began in earnest in that field outside Bethlehem. Scholars across Jewish, Christian, and Islamic traditions have recognized this moment as one of the most theologically loaded scenes in the entire biblical narrative. As we settle into what David's early life was forming in him, I want you to hold on to something simple and true. Greatness, at least in this story, does not announce itself. It grows quietly in ordinary places, through ordinary work, fill in people that others have overlooked. David did not know, in those years with the sheep, that he was becoming the kind of man who could rule a nation. He was just doing what needed to be done, protecting the flock, learning the land, developing the instincts and the courage that would later astonish armies. And God, according to the text, was watching all of it. Not the oldest son who looked right, not the 7 who stood in Jesse's hall, the one who was still at work when everyone else had gathered for the important event. There is something in that which feels true to human experience. The preparation that happens when no one is looking, the character that forms in the quiet and the difficult years before any visible recognition comes. We are about to leave the fields of Bethlehem behind, at least for now, and step into a very different world, a royal court filled with music and suspicion and the weight of a troubled king. Because here is what happens next in 1 Samuel. Word gets out that there is a young man in Bethlehem who plays the lyre beautifully, who is brave and wise and well-spoken, and the troubled King Saul needs exactly that kind of person near him. Oil drying on his forehead, shepherd's crook perhaps still in his hand, David is called to court. He will go from open fields to palace corridors, from the silence of the hills to the tension of a king's presence. And in that transition, the next chapter of his story, and the one I want to share with you next, begins to unfold. There are moments in ancient stories that feel like the hinge of everything. A single scene where the world pivots, where what came before and what comes after are clearly and permanently divided. I want to sit with you in one of those moments tonight. It is a quiet scene, really, tucked into the 16th chapter of 1 Samuel. No armies, no miracles splitting seas, no fire from heaven. Just an old prophet, a small town family, a horn filled with oil, and a boy called in from the fields. And yet what happens in this scene reaches forward across 3,000 years and touches Judaism, Christianity, and Islam in ways that are still being felt today. I find myself returning to this passage again and again, not just for its theology, but for its sheer human texture. The nervousness, the missteps, the surprise ending that was not a surprise to God at all. Let me walk you through it slowly, because it deserves that kind of attention. To understand what Samuel was risking when he walked into Bethlehem, you have to know where he was coming from emotionally and politically. The text in 1 Samuel chapter 16, verse 1, opens mid-grief. God speaks to Samuel and says, essentially, how long are you going to mourn for Saul? Samuel loved Saul. He had anointed him, believed in him, defended him, and then been forced to watch him unravel. The rejection of Saul was not just a political event for Samuel, it was a personal one. So when God tells him to fill his horn with oil and go to Bethlehem to anoint a new king, Samuel's first response is fear. How can I go? He says. If Saul hears about it, he will kill me. This is not an irrational concern. Saul was already a paranoid and violent man by this point in the story. Samuel was not wrong to be afraid. And I think it is worth noting that the text does not shame him for that fear. God simply gives him a practical way through it. Go make a sacrifice, bring Jesse, and I will show you the rest. Sometimes that is how guidance works. Not a full map, just the next step. Samuel arrives in Bethlehem, and the city elders come out to meet him with visible anxiety. The text in 1 Samuel 16, verse 4, tells us they trembled. A visiting prophet in the ancient world could mean many things, and not all of them were welcome. Samuel reassures them. He has come in peace to make a sacrifice. He consecrates Jesse and his sons and invites them to the ceremony. Walter Brueggemann, the Old Testament scholar whose work on the David narratives has been genuinely illuminating to me, and has written about how this scene is constructed with deliberate literary art. The 7 sons who pass and are rejected, the growing tension, the moment of revelation. The ancient storyteller knows exactly what they are doing. They are setting up an expectation, the tall, impressive son who looks like a king, and then undercutting it completely. The same thing happened with Saul. Saul looked like a king, and that, the text seems to be saying, is precisely the problem with human judgment. Eliab walks in first, and Samuel is immediately drawn to him. We read in verse 6 that Samuel looks at Eliab and thinks, surely this is the Lord's anointed. And then God speaks one of the most memorable lines in the entire Samuel narrative. Do not consider his appearance or his height, for I have rejected him. The Lord does not look at the things people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. These words land differently when you remember that Israel's first king was chosen precisely because he looked right. Tall, impressive, head and shoulders above everyone else. The text is consciously correcting that mistake. What matters is not what you see from the outside. And so, the parade continues. Abinadab, Shammah, and 4 more brothers all pass before Samuel, and each time the answer is the same. None of them. I imagine Samuel growing increasingly puzzled. God said one of Jesse's sons. But here they all are, and here the answer keeps being no. Then comes the question that changes everything. Samuel turns to Jesse and asks, almost like a last resort, are these all the sons you have? And Jesse's reply is one of those small, almost casual lines that the ancient storyteller uses to great effect. There is still the youngest, Jesse says in verse 11, but he is tending the sheep. There is something in that answer, a slight dismissiveness, perhaps, the way parents of large families sometimes categorize their children by birth order and role. The youngest one, he's out with the sheep. He wasn't even on the guest list for this gathering. Samuel's response is immediate. Send for him. We will not sit down until he arrives. And so someone runs out to the fields, and David comes in. The text describes him in verse 12, with a few vivid strokes, glowing with health, beautiful eyes, handsome in appearance. And God says, simply and completely, rise and anoint him. This is the one. What Samuel does next is both simple and enormous. He takes the horn of oil, the same kind of horn and the same act that had designated Saul years before, and he pours it over David's head, there in front of his brothers. The act of anointing, as scholars and historians of the ancient Near East have documented, was the standard form of royal consecration across the entire region. Egyptian pharaohs anointed vassal kings. Hittite records describe anointing rituals for their rulers. Ugaritic texts from the Bronze Age make reference to the practice. But in the Israelite tradition, this act carried something more than political designation. It was understood as divine election, a marking by God himself. The Hebrew word used here, mashash, is the exact root from which the word Messiah derives. In that sense, in every time the Jewish tradition speaks of the Messiah, every time the Christian tradition identifies Jesus as the Christ, which is simply the Greek translation of Messiah, there is a thread running back to this moment, to this oil, to this boy in Bethlehem. The theological weight of this scene across all three Abrahamic traditions is genuinely staggering when you let yourself sit with it. After the oil is poured, the text tells us in 1 Samuel 16 verse 13 that the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon David from that day forward. And then the narrative simply continues. No fanfare, no public announcement, no crown, no throne, no army assembling in his honor. David, as far as we can tell from the text, goes back to his life. Saul is still king. The throne is not David's. The anointing was private, known to Samuel, known to Jesse and his sons, and known to God. But the Spirit was real, and that Spirit was now working. I find this aspect of the story quietly profound. The most important moment in David's entire life happens in private, witnessed by family members who probably did not fully understand what they had just seen. There is no immediate reward, no visible change in circumstances, just oil and a promise, and the slow, invisible work of preparation that would take years to complete. Now, this is a moment where I want to be honest with you about what the text says and what it does not say. The private nature of David's anointing raises a question that scholars have wrestled with for centuries. Did David's brothers understand that he had just been anointed king? Did Jesse? The text does not tell us. What it does tell us is that David was anointed in their presence, which would have made the act visible, but the interpretation of its meaning could have ranged widely. In the interpretive tradition, across both Jewish and Christian scholarship, this private anointing is often read as the beginning of a long period of hidden preparation, a theme that appears throughout biblical narrative. The chosen one is marked before they are revealed. The seed is planted before the harvest is visible. Walter Brueggemann has described this section of Samuel as a narrative of God's subversive activity, God working beneath the surface of official history, preparing something that the powers of the day cannot see coming. As we rest in this moment, oil on a shepherd boy's head, the Spirit settling like something invisible and permanent, I want you to notice what this scene asks of us as listeners. It asks us to believe that what cannot be seen can still be real. It asks us to consider that the most significant choices about a person's life may be made in a field, or a back room, or a moment of quiet, that the world simply does not notice. David did not perform a single heroic act in this chapter. He did not ask for the anointing, did not campaign for it, did not even show up until someone was sent to get him. He was called, and he came, and the oil was poured, and the Spirit came. That is the whole story of this chapter, and in its simplicity, it carries something that I think human beings across all times and places have felt. the sense that we are sometimes being prepared for something larger than we can see, in circumstances that look nothing like what we expected. Now, the oil is drying on David's forehead, and the next step of his story is already beginning to form. There is a king in Jerusalem who is suffering, tormented by something the ancient writers describe as an evil spirit, a deep and restless distress that has settled over Saul like a shadow. His servants will recommend music as relief, and someone will mention a young man from Bethlehem who plays the lyre beautifully. The shepherd boy, who was just anointed in secret, will receive an invitation from the very man whose throne God has already decided to take away. And David will go, walking from the open fields into the closed and complicated world of a royal court, carrying a harp and an anointing that Saul knows nothing about. That is where we are headed next. See, and it is a chapter full of its own quiet tension and remarkable humanity. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine this. You are young, perhaps still a teenager. You have recently had oil poured over your head by one of the most revered prophets in the land, and you carry a secret that you cannot share with anyone. Then word comes that the king himself wants you at his court, not as a soldier or a servant, but as a musician. Not because of the secret anointing, not because anyone at court knows what happened in Bethlehem, but simply because you play the lyre well and the king cannot sleep. I want you to sit with the strangeness of that. The man whose throne God has already marked for David is the very man who now invites David into his inner circle, not knowing who he has just welcomed through the door. This is how the story of David and Saul begins. Not on a battlefield, not in a throne room with declarations of war, but in a private chamber with music hanging in the torchlit air between them. It is one of the most quietly ironic setups in all of ancient literature, and the text delivers it with remarkable restraint. The context for David's arrival at Saul's court begins with something the text describes in 1 Samuel chapter 16, verse 14, in terms that have puzzled and fascinated readers for centuries. We are told that the Spirit of the Lord had departed from Saul, and that an evil spirit from the Lord was tormenting him. This is one of the most theologically discussed lines in the entire book of Samuel. The Hebrew phrase used is ruach ra'ah, which can be translated as an evil spirit, or a harmful spirit, or a spirit of distress. What makes this complicated is that the text says, this spirit came from the Lord, which raises real interpretive questions that Jewish and Christian traditions have answered in different ways. Some read it as divine permission, God allowing a malevolent spiritual force to trouble Saul as a consequence of his disobedience. Others read Ruach Ra'ah as something closer to what we might today call severe psychological distress, a dark mood, a depression, a persistent inner anguish that had settled over the king. I want to be honest with you. The ancient writers leave this somewhat open, and scholars today continue to discuss it. What the text is clear about is this. Saul was suffering, visibly and seriously, and his court was looking for a solution. The solution his servants propose is music, and I find this detail genuinely remarkable from a historical perspective. The recommendation in 1 Samuel 16, verses 16 through 18, is practical and immediate. Let us find someone who plays the lyre, they say, so that when the dark spirit comes over you, he can play and you will feel better. What is fascinating here is that this is not presented as a magical cure or a religious ritual. It is offered as therapeutic relief, a recognition that music has real power over the human inner life. And this recognition was not unique to Israel. Ancient Mesopotamian medical texts, Egyptian healing records, and various documents from the ancient Near East all reflect an understanding that music was connected to physical and emotional well-being. The historian Flavius Josephus, writing centuries later in his Antiquities of the Jews, describes this episode and records that David's playing genuinely soothed Saul's affliction. Whether you read this moment through a spiritual lens or a psychological one, the ancient world understood something that modern neuroscience has confirmed. Music reaches places in a human being that words and reasoning cannot. Now, the recommendation that comes back to Saul's servants is specific. They describe David in 1 Samuel chapter 16, verse 18, with a list that is almost like a character reference. He is skillful in playing, they say, brave and strong, a warrior, prudent in speech, and handsome, and the Lord is with him. I love this description because it is doing two things at once. On the surface, it is recommending a court musician, but the qualities being listed, brave, strong, a warrior, prudent in speech, are not the qualities you lead with when recommending a harpist. They are the qualities of a leader. The ancient storyteller seems to be letting us glimpse what the people around David were beginning to notice, even if they did not yet understand what it meant. Saul, hearing this, sends messengers to Jesse with a request. "Send me your son, David." And Jesse, like a man who understood how these things worked in a monarchy, sends not just the boy, but gifts, a donkey, loaded with bread and wine, and a young goat. You did not arrive at a king's court empty-handed. David comes to Saul, and the text in 1 Samuel 16, verse 21, tells us two things that happened immediately. Saul liked him very much, and David became his armor-bearer. Think about what that second title means. An armor-bearer was one of the most trusted positions in an ancient military court. This was not a servant who polished equipment from a distance. An armor-bearer stood beside the king in battle, carried his weapons, protected him at close quarters, and was trusted with the king's life. For David to be appointed armor-bearer almost immediately upon arrival tells us something about how he carried himself, about the impression he made, about the combination of competence and personal presence that the text has been building toward. Saul was not a fool. Whatever his later failures, in these early scenes, he recognized quality when he saw it. And he wrote to Jesse, as we read in verse 22, asking that David be allowed to remain in his service permanently, because the text says, "He has found favor with me." And then comes the part of this story that I always find quietly beautiful. The text in 1 Samuel 16, verse 23, gives us the actual scene. Whenever the evil spirit from God came upon Saul, David would take up his lyre and play, and Saul would find relief. The spirit would leave him, and he would feel better. I want you to picture this: a tormented king sitting in his chamber, the darkness coming over him the way severe distress comes, unpredictably, heavily, blotting out whatever light had been there before, and a young shepherd boy with a lyre playing. We are not told what David played. We have no record of the specific songs from this period, but we know from the Psalms, many of which tradition attributes to David, with titles linking them to specific life events, that David's musical world was vast and deeply felt. It ranged from joy to lamentation, from triumph to desperate prayer. Whatever he played in Saul's chamber, it worked. The torment would ease. The king would breathe again. And the boy who carried an anointing Saul knew nothing about would pack up his instrument and perhaps wonder, in the quiet after the music, what God was doing with all of this. There is a detail in the ancient historian Josephus's account of this episode that I want to mention. Though carefully, It comes from his Antiquities of the Jews, which is a historical work, not scripture. Josephus describes Saul's affliction in terms of demonic oppression and writes about David's music as the means of relief with some specificity. What Josephus adds to the picture is the cultural context of the first century, how Jewish audiences of his time understood the connection between spiritual disturbance and musical healing. But I want to be clear. Josephus is a historian interpreting an ancient text, not an additional biblical source. His account reflects his own era's understanding and should be held separately from the canonical text of Samuel. What both the biblical account and Josephus agree on, however, is that this relationship between David and Saul began in genuine mutual regard, and that David's gift with music was real and recognized by everyone who heard it. What strikes me theologically about this entire episode is the layering of it. God's Spirit has come upon David, and David is brought into close proximity with the man from whom that Spirit has departed. It is as if God is doing something that the text never explicitly states, allowing David to be formed in the court of a king, to learn how power works from the inside, to observe leadership at its most intimate level before he is ever asked to lead himself. There is a tradition in both Jewish and Christian reflection that reads David's years in Saul's court as a school, not a comfortable one, as we will see, but a real one. David learned what kingship looked like from a man who was losing his grip on it. He learned what it felt like to be near authority without having it. He learned perhaps what he never wanted to become. And he learned this while playing music, while carrying armor, while navigating the daily rhythms of court life with the oil of anointing still invisibly marking him. As the music of David's lyre hangs in the air between them, king and shepherd boy, chosen and rejected, tortured and at peace, I want you to let this image settle quietly. It will not last. The tenderness of this early season will shatter, and we will watch it happen in chapters to come. But for now, there is something that feels almost like grace in the arrangement. A suffering man receiving comfort from the very one God has chosen to replace him. Neither of them knowing the full truth of what they are to each other. David is faithful to Saul in these early days. The text gives us no reason to doubt that. He serves, he plays, he carries the armor, he stays. And Saul, for a time, is genuinely grateful. This is the last season of uncomplicated relationship between them, and it is more human, more tender, and more complicated than the drama of later chapters might lead us to expect. The day is coming, and it will come quickly in the chapter that follows, when everything between David and Saul changes. A battle will be fought in a valley, a giant will fall, and a song will be sung about it in the streets of Israelite cities. And that song, an innocent victory celebration, will light a fire in Saul that never fully goes out. But for tonight, let the music play. Let the tormented king rest. Let the shepherd boy with oil in his hair sit in the firelight with his instrument, not yet knowing what tomorrow will ask of him. He is still learning who he is. And in our next chapter, a valley in the Shephelah will provide the most dramatic lesson yet. I want to take you down into a valley, not a peaceful one, a valley strung with tension, where two armies have been facing each other across a narrow strip of ground for 40 days without either side moving. The valley is called Elah, and it sits in the Shephelah region of ancient Judah, the rolling foothills between the coastal plain and the central highlands, where the Philistines and Israelites had been pressing against each other for generations. Archaeological excavations in this area, including significant work at the site identified with ancient Gath, the city of the Philistines, have confirmed this region as a genuine frontier zone, a place where cultures, armies, and civilizations collided. But on this particular day, the battlefield is unnervingly quiet. Because instead of two armies clashing, one enormous man walks out from the Philistine lines every morning and every evening, and he makes a proposal. Send out your best warrior. Let us settle this between two men. And for 40 days, the armies of Israel stand there, listening, and no one moves. Before we meet the man in the middle of that valley, let me give you some sense of what the Philistines represented in this period of history. These were not a ragtag group of local troublemakers. Archaeological work at Tel Dan, the site most strongly identified with ancient Gath, which the biblical text calls Goliath's home city, has uncovered remarkable evidence of a sophisticated culture. The Philistines arrived in Canaan from across the Aegean Sea, possibly connected to the broader migration of peoples that scholars call the Sea Peoples. During the upheaval following the late Bronze Age collapse around 1200 BCE, they brought with them distinct pottery styles, dual architectural traditions, and, critically, iron technology. The book of 1 Samuel tells us in chapter 13 that Israel was so outmatched metallurgically that Israelites were going to Philistine smiths just to sharpen their farm tools. Aaron Meir, who has led excavations at Tel Dan for years, has described a Philistine material culture that was genuinely distinct and advanced for the Iron Age Levant. These were formidable people, and from their ranks on this particular morning in the valley of Elah walked a man named Goliath. The description of Goliath in 1 Samuel chapter 17 is one of the most precise and technical in all of ancient battle literature, and I want to sit with it carefully because it deserves attention. His height is given as 6 cubits and a span, which, using the standard cubit measurement, works out to somewhere around 9 feet 9 inches. Now, I want to be honest with you here. This measurement is one of the most discussed and disputed details in the Goliath account. The Dead Sea Scrolls, those ancient Hebrew manuscripts discovered in the Judean desert in the 20th century, actually contain a variant reading of this passage that gives Goliath's height as 4 cubits and a span, which would be closer to 6 feet 9 inches. Scholars continue to discuss which reading is original. What is clear in either case is that Goliath was a man of exceptional size, and that his physical presence was deliberately intimidating. The ancient writer wants us to feel the weight of what Israel was looking at. Beyond his height, the description of Goliath's armor in 1 Samuel 17 is strikingly specific. He wore a bronze helmet. His coat of armor was made of scale armor and weighed 5,000 shekels of bronze, which scholars estimate at roughly 125 pounds of metal. He wore bronze greaves on his legs and carried a bronze javelin slung across his back. His spear shaft was like a weaver's rod, and its iron point weighed 600 shekels, roughly 15 pounds. These measurements, this specificity, they read like the account of someone who either saw this equipment or had access to very precise military records. K.A. Kitchen, the Egyptologist and biblical scholar, has written in his work on the reliability of the Old Testament that this kind of military detail is consistent with Iron Age warfare equipment and record-keeping practices. Whether or not every measurement is taken literally, the portrait being painted is of a professional warrior, fully equipped, representing the peak of Philistine military technology. And this is the man standing in the valley, shouting challenges at Israel every morning for 40 days. David arrives at the Israelite camp not as a soldier, but as a delivery boy. His father Jesse, back in Bethlehem, sends him to bring food to his 3 brothers who are serving in Saul's army, grain and bread and cheese. As we read in 1 Samuel 17, verses 17 and 18, he is carrying provisions, not weapons. And when he gets to the camp and hears Goliath's challenge and sees the reaction of the Israelite soldiers who run from the giant in fear, he starts asking questions. The older brother Eliab gets irritated with him and asking in verse 28 why he has come down and who is watching those few sheep. Eliab hears arrogance in David's questions, but David is not performing. He genuinely cannot understand why no one is doing anything. He keeps asking, and eventually his questions reach the ears of King Saul, who sends for him. And David, standing before the king, says something that I find remarkable for a boy who may have been as young as his mid-teens. Let no one lose heart on account of this Philistine. Your servant will go and fight him. Saul's response is practical and compassionate. You are too young, he says, and this man has been a warrior from his youth. But David does not deflect or back down. He tells Saul something that the king could not have known. I have been fighting things in those fields outside Bethlehem. In 1 Samuel 17, verses 34 through 36, David describes killing a lion and a bear, both of which had come after his sheep. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear, he says. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, because he has defied the armies of the living God. And then he says a line that reveals something deep about how David understood his own history. The Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will rescue me from the hand of this Philistine. He is not boasting about his own skill. He is testifying about his experience with God. He is drawing a straight line from the fields where no one was watching to the valley where everyone is watching. Saul, hearing this, says simply, "Go, and the Lord be with you." Saul tries to dress David in his own armor, his tunic, his coat of armor, his bronze helmet. David puts it on, takes a few steps, and says he cannot go in this because he is not used to it. So he takes it off. What he does instead is go down to a nearby stream and carefully select 5 smooth stones, which he puts in his shepherd's pouch. He takes his staff and his sling. That is his entire arsenal. Now, I want you to think about this moment, because it says something important about David that goes beyond the immediate story. He is given the king's armor, the most official, most legitimized form of military equipment available, and he gives it back. He goes with what he knows. He goes with what has worked in the fields, in the real world, against real threats when no one was there to see. There is something in that choice, rejecting borrowed identity in favor of genuine experience, that will define David throughout his entire life. Goliath, when he sees David walking toward him, reacts with what sounds like offended disbelief. He looks David over, and we read in 1 Samuel 17, verse 42, he despised him because he was just a boy, ruddy and handsome. He says to David, "Am I a dog that you come at me with sticks?" And then he curses David by his gods and tells him he will give his flesh to the birds and the wild animals. David's response is one of the great speeches of the Hebrew Bible. He says in verses 45 through 47, "You come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied." And then he says the line that I think the whole scene has been building toward. The battle is the Lord's, and he will give all of you into our hands. David is not saying he will win because he is skilled. He is saying the outcome of this battle has already been determined by something larger than either of them. And then he runs, actually runs, toward Goliath. The ending of the battle is told with deliberate speed in the text. David reaches into his bag, takes out a stone, slings it, and the stone sinks into the forehead of the giant. Goliath falls face down on the ground. David runs to him, takes Goliath's own sword. He has no sword of his own, and kills him with it and cuts off his head. The Philistine army, seeing their champion is dead, turns and runs. The Israelites pursue them. One boy with a sling and 5 smooth stones, though it only took one, ends a standoff that an entire army could not resolve in 40 days. Now, I want to acknowledge something here that the text itself raises and that scholars have discussed honestly. In 2 Samuel chapter 21, verse 19, there is a reference to a man named Elhanan who killed Goliath the Gittite. This is a genuine textual complexity. It appears in the canonical scripture and creates an apparent contradiction with the chapter 17 account. The book of 1 Chronicles, chapter 20, verse 5, appears to offer a harmonization, but the tension remains a real one in biblical scholarship, and I do not want to gloss over it. What I can tell you is that the account in 1 Samuel 17 has been the primary narrative through which Jewish, Christian, and Islamic traditions have received this story for millennia. As the dust settles in the valley of Elah and the Israelite shout of victory rises over those Shephelah hills, I want you to feel the full weight of what just happened. Not just for Israel, but for David. He walked into that valley as a delivery boy. He walked out as the most famous warrior in the land. Everything is different now. And here is the thing about moments like that. They do not just change your circumstances. They change how other people see you. Within hours, David will be brought before Saul. Alliances will form. A friendship unlike any other in the Bible will begin. And simultaneously, in a place Saul cannot yet see, a jealousy will begin to grow that will eventually drive David from the court into the wilderness, into years of exile. The stone has left the sling. The giant has fallen. And in the next chapter, we will watch what victory costs and what it sets in motion in the heart of a king who is beginning to realize that the boy he invited into his court may be the very thing he should have feared most. There is a particular kind of pain that comes from watching someone you trusted begin to look at you differently, not with warmth, not with the regard they once held for you, but with something colder and more dangerous, something that starts as suspicion and curdles over time into hatred. I want to walk you through one of the most psychologically honest portraits in all of ancient literature tonight, because what happens between Saul and David after the Valley of Elah is not a simple story of a villain and a hero. It is a story about what power does to a person who is already losing their grip on it, and what grace looks like in a young man who could have fought back but chose not to. The text of 1 Samuel gives us this deterioration in careful, almost painful detail, scene by scene, incident by incident. And I find myself reading it the way you read something true, something that describes not just ancient figures, but recognizable human nature. Let me take you into it slowly, because it deserves that kind of attention. The trouble begins, of all places, with a song. After David kills Goliath and the Israelite army routs the Philistines, the army returns home, and the women of the Israelite cities come out to meet them. They are singing and dancing, playing tambourines and lyres, celebrating the victory. And the song they sing is recorded in 1 Samuel chapter 18, verses 7 and 8, and it goes like this: Saul has slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s. That is it. That is the whole lyric. A simple victory chant, the kind that soldiers' wives and mothers have sung after battles throughout human history. But Saul hears it, and something shifts in him immediately. The text tells us in verse 8 that Saul was very angry, and that this refrain galled him. He says, They have credited David with 10,000s, but me with only thousands. What more can he get but the kingdom? He is not wrong, exactly, about the arithmetic of the song. David's number is bigger. But the leap he makes from a celebration song to a political threat tells us everything about the state of Saul's inner world. The jealousy that will define the rest of his relationship with David is born in that moment, listening to women singing in the streets. From that day forward, the text tells us in 1 Samuel 18 verse 9, Saul kept a close eye on David. The Hebrew phrase used there carries the sense of looking with suspicion, watching with an eye toward threat. And the very next day, not weeks later, not after some accumulation of evidence, the evil spirit that had been tormenting Saul comes upon him again. And this time, while David is playing the lyre as he had done many times before, Saul picks up a spear. The text in verses 10 and 11 is blunt about what happens. Saul hurled the spear, saying to himself, "I'll pin David to the wall." David evades him. Twice this happens. Twice Saul hurls the spear. Twice David avoids it. Think about what that scene looks like in physical terms. A young man playing music to soothe a suffering king, and the king throws a weapon at him. Not once, in a moment of total madness, but twice. The relationship between them has crossed a threshold from which there is no returning. The music that once brought relief has become, in Saul's distorted perception, a reminder of everything he is losing. Now, I want to pause here and be fair to Saul, because the text is more honest about him than popular retellings often are. When we first met Saul back in 1 Samuel 9 and 10, he was genuinely impressive, humble even. When Samuel anointed him, Saul's response was bewilderment. He was from Benjamin, the smallest tribe, from the least of the clans. He was not seeking power. He was chosen, and he tried, and for a while he did well. Scholars like Walter Brueggemann have written carefully about the tragedy of Saul, that he was a man whose early promise was real, whose failures were tied to a specific kind of fear that the text describes as the fear of people rather than the fear of God. His disobedience in 1 Samuel 13 and 15 was not malice. It was panic, the impulse to manage a situation that felt out of control. And now, watching David's popularity grow, feeling the spirit that once carried him now pressing on him as distress, Saul is a man watching his world dissolve. That does not excuse what he does, but it explains it in a way that is genuinely human. The political maneuvering that Saul uses against David in this season is cunning, and the text traces it in detail. Saul had promised to give his daughter Merab to the man who killed Goliath. 1 Samuel 17, verse 25 records that pledge. But when the time comes, Merab is given to someone else. Then Saul learns that his younger daughter Michal loves David. And here the text shows us Saul's mind working in a way that is chilling in its calculation. 1 Samuel 18, verse 21, records Saul's internal reasoning. I will give her to him, he thought, so that she may be a snare to him, and so that the hand of the Philistines may be against him. He is using his own daughter's love as a weapon. The bride price he sets is not money or livestock. It is 100 Philistine foreskins, which means David has to go into enemy territory and fight to earn the right to marry Michal. Saul's hope, the text tells us plainly, is that David will fall in the process. David brings back 200 foreskins, double what was asked. Michal becomes his wife. And Saul, we read in verse 29, became still more afraid of David, and he remained his enemy for the rest of his days. What happens next involves someone whose loyalty becomes one of the most celebrated relationships in the entire biblical narrative. Jonathan, Saul's son, the crown prince, the man who by all human logic should be David's chief rival, becomes instead his closest friend. The covenant between them is introduced first in 1 Samuel 18, verses 3 and 4, immediately after the Goliath victory. Jonathan makes a covenant with David, and he strips off his own royal robe and his tunic and his armor and gives them to David. This is not a casual gesture. In the ancient world, to give your robe was to give your identity, your status, your position. Jonathan, the heir to the throne, is symbolically transferring something to the man God has already chosen. Whether Jonathan understood the full theological weight of what he was doing is something the text leaves open. But the act is recorded with the weight of something significant, and it recurs throughout their relationship. When Saul directly commands Jonathan to kill David in 1 Samuel 19 verse 1, Jonathan refuses. He warns David. He pleads David's case before Saul with genuine eloquence. He puts his own standing and eventually his own safety at risk for the sake of a friendship that transcends every political calculation around it. The deterioration of Saul's campaign against David accelerates in 1 Samuel chapter 19 in ways that are almost dizzying to follow. Saul sends messengers to David's house to watch it and kill him in the morning. Michal, David's wife, learns of the plan and helps David escape through a window, echoing, in a way, stories of narrowly avoided catastrophe that appear across ancient literature. She places a household idol in David's bed, with goat's hair at its head to deceive the messengers. When Saul confronts her, she tells him David threatened to kill her if she did not help him. Whether this is true or a protective lie, the text does not say. Then Saul sends messengers to capture David at the prophet Samuel's location in Ramah, and something extraordinary and deeply strange happens. The messengers arrive, see a group of prophets prophesying with Samuel, and they begin prophesying themselves. Saul sends a second group, same result. A third group, same result. Finally, Saul goes himself, and the Spirit of God falls on him too, and he prophesies before Samuel and lies stripped of his garments all day and all night. The text closes this section with a question the people ask: is Saul also among the prophets? A question that appeared earlier in a positive context, but here lands with a much darker irony. What I want to reflect on theologically for a moment is the contrast the text is drawing with great deliberateness throughout these chapters. 1 Samuel 18 verse 12 gives us the theological engine of the whole section. Saul was afraid of David because the Lord was with David but had departed from Saul. That is the hinge on which everything turns. This is what scholars call Deuteronomistic theology. The understanding woven through the books of Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings, that obedience to God produces divine presence and favor, and disobedience produces its withdrawal. Saul's fear of David is, at a deeper level, Saul's recognition, perhaps not fully conscious, but real, that the presence he once knew is now with someone else. The jealousy, the spear-throwing, the murderous scheming. These are all, in the text's understanding, the behavior of a man who has lost the thing that made him what he was, and cannot bear to watch it flourishing in another. There is something in that portrait that I find genuinely tragic and genuinely recognizable. As we draw this chapter toward its close, I want you to hold two things at once, because the text holds them at once. David is innocent in this section. He does not scheme against Saul, does not seek allies to overthrow him, does not leverage his popularity against the king. His military success in verse 14 is attributed simply to the fact that the Lord was with him. He is loyal, skilled, faithful, and in real danger. And Saul is dangerous. There is no minimizing the spear thrown twice, the murder plots, the manipulation of his own daughter. And yet, Saul is also a man in genuine anguish, watching something slip through his hands that he cannot hold on to. The ancient writer does not ask us to excuse Saul's behavior, but they do ask us to understand it, and understanding it, seeing the human fear beneath the violence, the grief beneath the jealousy, is what keeps this from being a simple story about good and evil, and makes it instead a story about something much more true and much more lasting. The storm between Saul and David is just beginning to build to its full force. What comes next will take David out of the court entirely, into the wilderness, into years of hiding and running and surviving. But before that exile begins completely, there is one more conversation between Jonathan and David, a meeting in a field, a shot arrow, a farewell that the text describes with genuine tenderness. And then David runs. He runs from the court where he played music by torchlight, from the king who loved him and then tried to kill him, from the palace corridors he learned to navigate so carefully. And as we follow him out into the open air of the Judean wilderness in our next chapter, we will find that exile for David is not the end of the story. It is, in a way, the real beginning of it. There is something about the wilderness that does things to a person that a palace never could. Strip away the comfort, the routine, the familiar faces, and the known pathways, and what remains is a person reduced to their essential self, what they actually believe, what they actually fear, what they are actually made of, when no one is watching and no one is coming to help. I want to take you into the wilderness with David tonight, into those years of running and hiding and surviving that the text of 1 Samuel traces across several chapters with remarkable geographical and human detail. This is not a short season in David's life. The fugitive years stretch across something like a decade, threading through the hills and caves and desert wadis of Judah, through moments of mercy and moments of violence, through loneliness and through the gradual gathering of a ragged community around a man who had nothing to offer but his own extraordinary self. Let me walk you through it, because this season, more than the anointing, more than Goliath, is where David becomes who he actually is. The flight begins in earnest after Jonathan and David's farewell, which is told in 1 Samuel chapter 20, with a tenderness that is almost startling in a war narrative. They had agreed on a signal. Jonathan would shoot arrows, and the words he called to his servant would tell David whether it was safe to stay or necessary to run. The arrows fly, the words are called out, and David knows he cannot stay. He comes out from hiding, and the two men fall on each other weeping, the text says in verse 41, with David weeping the most. Jonathan says to him, "Go in peace, for we have sworn friendship with each other in the name of the Lord." And then David goes, and Jonathan returns to the city. This farewell is important to hold in your heart as we move into the next chapters, because the warmth and loyalty of this friendship stands in sharp contrast to almost everything else David is about to experience. Days of danger, false allies, real enemies, and the grinding uncertainty of a life lived on the run. David's first stop after leaving Jonathan is a place called Nob, which was where the tabernacle and the priestly community had been established. He arrives, alone and unarmed, before the priest Ahimelech, and the text in 1 Samuel chapter 21, verse 1, tells us that Ahimelech trembled when he met David and asked why he was alone. David tells him a half-truth. He is on a secret mission for the king, His men are meeting him elsewhere. He asks for food and weapons. Ahimelech gives him the consecrated bread, the showbread, the bread of the presence that was typically reserved for priests, as noted in verse 6, because it is all that is available. And for a weapon, the only thing in the sanctuary is Goliath's sword, which had been kept there wrapped in a cloth behind the ephod. David takes it, saying in verse 9, "There is none like it. Give it to me." It is a strange and layered moment. The sword of the giant David killed, kept in a sanctuary, given back to him on the day he becomes a fugitive. What the text does not tell David, and what the reader finds out later in chapter 22, is that a man named Doeg, the Edomite, Saul's chief herdsman, is there watching. He will report everything to Saul, and the consequences for Ahimelech and the entire priestly community at Nob will be devastating. From Nob, David does something that must have felt completely counterintuitive. He goes to Gath. Gath, the Philistine city, Goliath's home city. David, the man who killed Gath's champion, and whose name the women of Israel sang above Saul's, walks into Gath. The servants of Achish, the king of Gath, recognize him immediately. They say in 1 Samuel 21, verse 11, "Isn't this David, the king of the land? Isn't he the one they sing about in their dances?" David hears this, and the text tells us simply that he was very much afraid. So he does something remarkable. He pretends to be mad. He makes marks on the doors of the gate. He lets saliva run down his beard. Achish looks at him and says, in verse 15, "Am I so short of madmen that you have to bring this fellow here to carry on like this in front of me?" And David is sent away. He survives by performing total humiliation. The future king of Israel, the anointed man of God, drools on a gate in a Philistine city to stay alive. I find this one of the most startlingly honest scenes in the entire narrative. There is nothing heroic or polished about it. It is pure, desperate survival. From Gath, David makes his way to the cave of Adullam, she in the Shephelah region of Judah. And this is where something begins to change. The text in 1 Samuel chapter 22, verses 1 and 2, gives us a picture of who gathers around David in that cave. His brothers come, his father's household comes, and then others begin to arrive. People in distress, people in debt, people who are bitter of soul. 400 men gather to him, and David becomes their leader. I want you to think about who these people are. They are not an elite fighting force. They are not trained soldiers with armor and weapons and military discipline. They are the desperate ones, the marginalized ones, the ones who have nothing left to lose. And David, anointed king, skilled warrior, man of God, becomes their captain. This is the community that will eventually become the core of David's army, the veterans of his hardest years, the men who will fight for him, not because he is powerful, but because he was with them when they had nothing. There is something deeply human in that kind of loyalty, the kind that forms not in prosperity, but in shared difficulty. The geography of David's fugitive years is specific and consistent with the actual terrain of ancient Judah, which I find quietly compelling. Yohanan Aharoni, the Israeli archaeologist and geographer who mapped the ancient land of the Bible with great care, traced the regions mentioned in these chapters: the Shephelah, the wilderness of Ziph, the wilderness of Maon, En Gedi near the Dead Sea, and found them entirely consistent with the natural hiding terrain of the Judean landscape. These are places of limestone caves, deep wadis, desert plateaus, and sparse water sources. A man who knew this terrain, and David had grown up in the hills of Judah, could hide effectively for a long time. He moves his parents to Moab for their safety, as recorded in 1 Samuel 22, verse 3. He receives counsel from a prophet named Gad. He moves from region to region, staying ahead of Saul's pursuit, and all the while his band grows. By the time we reach 1 Samuel 23, his force has grown to 600 men, a number that represents a genuine guerrilla fighting force, capable of defending towns and engaging enemies. One episode from this wilderness period that I want to sit with briefly is David's time at Elah, recorded in 1 Samuel chapter 23. A Philistine raiding party is attacking the threshing floors of a Judahite town called Elah, and David asks God whether he should go and fight them. His own men are afraid. They say in verse 3, "Here in Judah we are afraid. How much more then if we go to Elah against the Philistine forces?" But God gives David a clear answer. Go. David attacks the Philistines, rescues Elah, and saves the town. And then, almost immediately, he discovers that Saul is coming for him, and that the people of Elah, the very town he just saved, would hand him over to Saul if Saul came. So David and his 600 men leave Elah and go back into the wilderness. He saved a town that would not protect him. He risked his life for people who would have betrayed him. And then he walked away, without bitterness, back into the desert. There is something in that pattern of giving without guaranteed return, of faithfulness in the face of ingratitude, that shows up again and again in David's character during these wilderness years. The Psalm tradition has always associated this period of David's life with some of the most honest and desperate poetry in the entire Psalter. The heading of Psalm 57, for example, places it when he had fled from Saul into the cave, and the opening lines of that psalm carry the exact emotional texture of what we have been tracing. "Have mercy on me, my God. Have mercy on me, for in you I take refuge." The psalmist writes in verse 1, "I will take refuge in the shadow of your wings until the disaster has passed." Now, I want to be careful here and tell you clearly. The attribution of specific psalms to specific events in David's life is traditional rather than definitively historical. These psalm titles were added at some point in the editing of the Book of Psalms and represent the interpretive tradition of the community that preserved them. Scholars debate whether David wrote the psalms attributed to him, or whether some were written later in his name, or whether the tradition is more accurate than critical scholarship has sometimes allowed. What I can say is that the emotional content of psalms like 57 fits the wilderness experience with a kind of intimacy that is hard to dismiss entirely. What I find theologically rich about this entire fugitive season is the way it functions in the text's understanding as a school of character. David enters the wilderness as a celebrated warrior and a frightened young man. He navigates it through a combination of cunning, genuine faith, practical skill, and the ability to gather and lead desperate people. He makes mistakes. The half-truth to Ahimelech at Nob has catastrophic consequences when Saul massacres 85 priests there in 1 Samuel 22, verses 18 and 19, because of Doeg's report. David carries the weight of that tragedy. He tells the lone survivor, Abiathar, in verse 22, "I am responsible for the deaths of your whole family." He does not deflect the guilt. He owns it, and he keeps Abiathar with him from that point forward. This is a man learning, in the hardest possible classroom, what leadership actually costs. Not the glory of Goliath falling in a valley, but the quiet and irreversible consequences of decisions made under pressure. As we come toward the end of this chapter, I want you to carry with you a particular image. David, somewhere in the Judean wilderness, in a cave or on a rocky plateau, or beside a spring in the desert, surrounded by 600 men who came to him broken and have become, through shared hardship, something like a community. He has no throne. He has no city. He has a sword that used to belong to a giant. He has the anointing that was poured over him in Bethlehem, invisible and real. And he has developed, in these years, a quality that will define him more than his military victories ever do, a quality of restraint, of mercy, of the ability to hold power lightly, even when anger would justify using it. That quality is about to be tested in a way that is almost too direct to be comfortable. Because Saul, the man who threw spears at him, who massacred priests for helping him, who has been hunting him across the wilderness for years, is about to walk into a cave where David is hiding. And David will have every justification in the world to end it right there. What he chooses to do instead is one of the most remarkable moments in the entire story. I want you to imagine a moment that requires more moral courage than almost any battle. You are hiding in the back of a cave, in the dark, with your men around you. You have been hunted for years by a man who wants you dead. You have slept on hard ground and eaten whatever the wilderness provided. You have watched innocent people suffer because of you. And then, into that cave, walks the man who has done all of this to you, unaware that you are there, unaware that you are watching. He is close enough to touch. He is vulnerable. Your men whisper that this is the moment God promised. And you reach out your hand, not to kill, but to cut a corner of fabric from his robe. And even that small act troubles your conscience afterward. This is the scene the text of 1 Samuel chapter 24 gives us, and I find it one of the most searching moral scenes in all of ancient writing. It does not ask us to admire David from a distance. It asks us to sit inside the decision with him, to feel the weight of what he chooses and what he refuses. Let me take you there. The setting is En Gedi, a remarkable oasis on the western shore of the Dead Sea, a place of freshwater springs and cave systems cut into the limestone cliffs above a desert that falls away toward the lowest point on Earth. Archaeological surveys confirm this region as part of the Judean wilderness that David's band would have moved through during his fugitive years. Saul is pursuing David with 3,000 chosen men. The text gives us that number in 1 Samuel 24, verse 2. And he stops to relieve himself in a cave, the cave where David and his men happen to be hiding. The men with David immediately interpret this as divine intervention. They say to David in verse 4, "This is the day the Lord spoke of, when he said to you, I will give your enemy into your hands for you to deal with as you wish." They are sure. They are certain. They give him the theological framework and the practical opportunity, and they tell him this is the moment. And David gets up and goes forward in the darkness, and he cuts off a corner of Saul's robe. Just the corner, not the man. What happens immediately after is something I find deeply moving. The text tells us in verse 5 that David was conscience-stricken after he had cut off the corner of Saul's robe. Conscience-stricken. He went back to his men, and he said, and these are the words recorded in verses 6 and 7. "The Lord forbid that I should do such a thing to my master, the Lord's anointed, or lay my hand on him. For he is the anointed of the Lord." His men had wanted him to kill Saul. He refused to, and he would not even allow them to attack Saul. He rebuked them, the text says, and did not permit them to rise against Saul. Think about the kind of leadership that requires. He has just made a decision that his entire fighting force thinks is wrong. He has given up what they see as a gift from God, and he has to hold that position against 600 men who have been living in caves for years because of this king. David holds the line, not because he cannot see what his men see, He is standing there with the corner of Saul's robe in his hand. He holds the line because of a principle that runs deeper than his own grievance. After Saul leaves the cave, David comes out and calls after him. He bows with his face to the ground, showing submission, not defiance. And he calls out in 1 Samuel 24, verse 11, "This day you have seen with your own eyes how the Lord delivered you into my hands in the cave. Some urged me to kill you, but I spared you. I said, I will not lay my hand on my Lord, because he is the Lord's anointed." He holds up the piece of robe as evidence. He makes his case clearly. "See this? I could have killed you. I chose not to." And then he says something that I think tells us everything about how David understood his situation. Verse 12, "May the Lord judge between you and me, and may the Lord avenge the wrongs you have done to me, but my hand will not touch you." He is not handing over the right of revenge. He is not pretending the injustice does not exist. He is placing the judgment in the hands of God and removing it from his own hands. This is the theological center of the passage. A man who believes so deeply that God is sovereign that he can afford to absorb injustice rather than answer it with violence. Saul's response to this speech is startling. The king who has been hunting David, who threw spears at him, who sent assassins to his house, who massacred a community of priests. This king weeps. We read in 1 Samuel 24, verse 16, that when David finished speaking, Saul asked, "Is that your voice, David, my son?" And he wept aloud. He says in verse 17, "You are more righteous than I. You have treated me well, but I have treated you badly." He acknowledges everything. He says in verse 20 that he knows David will be king and that the kingdom of Israel will be established in David's hands. He even asks David to swear not to wipe out his descendants when that day comes. It is a moment of genuine clarity in a man who has been lost in jealousy and fear for years, as if the sight of David's mercy cuts through all the distortion, and Saul sees, just for a moment, with completely clear eyes. David makes the oath. They part ways. Saul goes home. And David, tellingly, does not follow him back to the court. He and his men go back up to the stronghold. He is not naive about what just happened. A moment of clarity in Saul is not the same as a permanent change in Saul. And he is right not to trust it completely, because a nearly identical scene happens again in 1 Samuel chapter 26. This is one of the genuinely disputed areas of scholarship around the David narrative. Some scholars believe chapters 24 and 26 describe two different accounts of the same event, preserved separately in the tradition and placed in sequence. Others read them as two distinct incidents with genuine differences in location, cast, and circumstances. The textual differences are real. In chapter 24, David is in a cave at En Gedi and cuts Saul's robe. In chapter 26, and David is on a hill at Elah and takes Saul's spear and water jug from beside his head while Saul sleeps. The characters who accompany David are different. The dialogue is different. I want to be honest with you about this because the text itself raises it. An honest reading means acknowledging genuine complexity rather than pretending it away. What both accounts agree on, regardless of their relationship to each other, is the principle at their center. David will not kill Saul. In the chapter 26 account, David goes down into the Philistine camp at night with a man named Abishai, Joab's brother. They find Saul asleep with his spear stuck in the ground beside his head and his water jug nearby. Abishai says in verse 8, "Today God has delivered your enemy into your hands. Now let me pin him to the ground with one thrust of the spear." He is even offering to do it himself. David does not have to raise his own hand. And David's answer is the same as in the cave. Don't destroy him. Who can lay a hand on the Lord's anointed and be guiltless? He takes the spear and the water jug, and they leave. No one wakes up. They move through the camp like shadows. And then David, from a safe distance on a hilltop opposite the camp, calls out to Abner, Saul's commander, and mocks him for failing to protect his king. He holds up the spear and the water jug as evidence. Once again, Saul's voice is heard. Is that your voice, David, my son? Once again, Saul acknowledges his wrongdoing, and once again, they part without reconciliation and without violence. What I find theologically striking when I hold these two episodes together is the consistency of the principle that governs David's behavior. In both cases, his men give him the same interpretation of events. God has delivered your enemy into your hand. This is the moment. In both cases, David refuses, using almost identical language about the Lord's anointed. In both cases, Saul has a moment of apparent clarity, and in both cases, nothing permanently changes in their relationship. The principle of the inviolability of the Lord's anointed, the understanding that God's designated leaders cannot be touched by human hands without divine sanction, runs deeply through the Deuteronomistic tradition that shaped the books of Samuel and Kings. David is not simply being strategically cautious, though there is wisdom in his restraint. He is operating from a theological conviction that the outcome of his situation is God's responsibility, not his own to engineer through violence. What I want to reflect on as we think about what these scenes meant theologically for the communities that preserved them is something that A. Anderson, in his Word, Biblical Commentary on 2 Samuel, has written about carefully. The portrait of David in these wilderness chapters is consciously shaped to show legitimate kingship. A king who comes to power not through assassination or coup, but through patience, faithfulness, and the unfolding of divine will. The early readers of these texts would have known that David did eventually become king, and that Saul did eventually die. The question the text is answering is not whether David will be king, but how he becomes king. And the answer it gives, twice through these cave and hilltop encounters, is that David became king without blood on his hands from Saul's death. This matters enormously for the legitimacy of everything that follows. A dynasty built on murder is a dynasty always looking over its shoulder. A dynasty built on the patience of God's timing is, at least in the theological understanding of the ancient writers, something more durable. As we settle toward the close of this chapter, I want you to sit with the image of David standing on that hilltop in the dark, holding a spear he refused to use. Below him, an army. Beside him, 600 men who would have understood if he had made a different choice. Behind him, years of injustice that would have justified, in almost any human court, a very different decision. And in his hand, not the blood of a king, but proof that he could have shed it and chose not to. There is a kind of power in restraint that is harder to maintain than the power of action. Most of us never face anything quite as stark as David's choice in that cave and on that hilltop, but we understand the pull, the moment when everything lines up to justify the thing we wanted to do anyway, and someone has to decide whether justification is the same as rightness. David decided twice that it was not. He gave the spear back to God and walked away. The season of David's waiting in the wilderness is drawing toward its end, though David does not know it. Saul's grip on the kingdom is loosening, not because David overthrew him, but because Saul is being undone by his own choices and by the steady pressure of the Philistine threat that has never gone away. A final battle is approaching at a place called Mount Gilboa, and it will not be David who fights it. In our next chapter, I want to walk you to the edge of that battlefield, through a night visit to a medium in a village called Endor, through the death of a king and his sons, and through a lament that may be the oldest Hebrew poem we have, written by the man who had every reason to celebrate Saul's death and instead wept over it. There is a kind of ending that comes not with triumph, but with grief, an ending that is necessary and perhaps even just, but that still carries weight because the person who is ending was once something more than what they became. I want to take you to the final hours of Saul's life tonight, because the text of 1 Samuel handles this ending with a care and a sorrow that surprises me every time I read it. We are moving now from the wilderness years, from the caves and the hilltops and the midnight raids, to a single long night in a village called Endor, and then to a mountain called Gilboa, where the morning will bring a disaster that reshapes everything. And then we will walk with David through his genuine grief over the man who tried to kill him, and watch as the long road to Hebron begins. This is a chapter about endings and beginnings, about what honor looks like in the face of a complicated death, and about the patience that ultimately outlasts even its most relentless opposition. The scene at Endor is one of the most debated passages in the entire Hebrew Bible, and I want to approach it carefully because it deserves that. Saul, on the eve of a massive Philistine assault, is terrified. The text in 1 Samuel chapter 28, verse 5, tells us he saw the Philistine army and was afraid in his heart, the Hebrew says. He inquires of the Lord through dreams, through the Urim, through prophets, and receives no answer. God is silent, and in that silence, Saul makes a desperate decision. He disguises himself and travels at night to the village of Endor to find a woman described in the Hebrew text as a Baalat of, a mistress of a spirit, or, as many translations render it, a medium. Now I want to be clear about something here. The Hebrew term Baalat of refers to a ritual specialist, someone who claimed the ability to communicate with the dead, and not to the theatrical figure of popular imagination. Saul himself had expelled all such practitioners from Israel. So by going to this woman, he is violating his own law and, more deeply, his own covenant commitments. The woman is afraid when Saul asks her to bring up Samuel, because she suspects a trap. He swears to her that she will not be punished, and she proceeds. What happens next is genuinely unusual, and I want to be honest with you about the fact that it has been interpreted very differently across Jewish, Christian, and secular scholarship over the centuries. An apparition of Samuel appears, and the text describes the woman's reaction as one of shock, as if something actually happened that she was not expecting. Samuel's spirit, or something presented as Samuel's spirit, speaks to Saul, and what it says is unambiguous and devastating. We read in 1 Samuel 28, verse 16 through 19. "Why do you consult me, now that the Lord has departed from you and become your enemy? The Lord has done what he predicted through me. The Lord has torn the kingdom out of your hands and given it to one of your neighbors, to David. Because you did not obey the Lord or carry out his fierce wrath against the Amalekites, the Lord has done this to you today. The Lord will deliver both Israel and you into the hands of the Philistines. And tomorrow you and your sons will be with me. Tomorrow. Tomorrow, the voice tells Saul, it will be over. What strikes me about Saul's response is not denial or argument. He collapses. He falls full length on the ground, overwhelmed with fear, weakened by the fact that he had not eaten all day. The woman, showing a humanity the text preserves carefully, urges him to eat. She kills a fattened calf and bakes bread and feeds him, and he eats and then goes out into the night to his last mourning. The Battle of Mount Gilboa is told in the final chapter of 1 Samuel, with a brevity that somehow makes it heavier. The Philistines fight Israel, men of Israel flee before them, and many fall on Mount Gilboa. 3 of Saul's sons, Jonathan, Abinadab, and Malchishua, are killed in the fighting, as we read in 1 Samuel 31 verse 2. Jonathan, the man who gave David his robe and his friendship and his loyalty, Jonathan dies on that mountain. Saul is critically wounded by archers and asks his armor-bearer to run him through with a sword so the Philistines cannot abuse him. The armor-bearer refuses. He is terrified, the text says. And so Saul falls on his own sword. When the armor-bearer sees that Saul is dead, he falls on his own sword as well. The Philistines find Saul's body the next day, cut off his head, and fasten his body to the wall of the city of Bethshan. The men of Jabesh Gilead, a city Saul had once rescued in one of his earliest acts as king, travel through the night to retrieve the bodies and give them proper burial. It is a final gesture of loyalty to a king who, for all his failures, had once been genuinely great. The historian Josephus, in his Antiquities of the Jews, records this episode and adds some contextual detail about the Philistine response, though his account follows the biblical narrative closely at this point. David does not know all of this immediately. He is in the south, at Ziklag, and an Amalekite messenger arrives with his clothes torn and dust on his head, the ancient signs of mourning, carrying Saul's crown and armband. The story the messenger tells in 2 Samuel chapter 1 is that he came upon Saul leaning on his spear, about to be overtaken by the Philistines, and that Saul asked him to finish what the sword had started, and that he did. This account contradicts 1 Samuel 31, which says Saul died by his own hand. Scholars have debated whether the messenger is lying, fabricating a heroic role for himself in hopes of a reward from the man who will now be king, or whether there is a genuine textual tension between the two accounts. What is clear is how David responds. He does not celebrate. He does not thank the messenger. He asks him, "Were you not afraid to lift your hand against the Lord's anointed?" And he has the man executed. The principle from the caves and the hilltops holds, even after the fact. Then David and all the men with him mourn and weep and fast until evening, for Saul and for Jonathan, and for the people of the Lord and the army of Israel. And David composes what the text calls the Lament of the Bow, a poem recorded in 2 Samuel chapter 1, verses 17 through 27. This poem, known by its opening words as "How the Mighty Have Fallen," is remarkable for what it does and does not do. It does not mention God. It does not frame Saul's death as justice or divine judgment. It does not celebrate the opening of a path to David's throne. It grieves. It grieves Saul and Jonathan together, and it grieves them honestly. Listen to some of these words from verse 23. Saul and Jonathan. In life they were loved and admired, and in death they were not parted. They were swifter than eagles. They were stronger than lions. And from verse 26, where David speaks of Jonathan directly, I grieve for you, Jonathan, my brother. You were very dear to me. Your love for me was wonderful, more wonderful than that of women. Many scholars believe this lament may be one of the oldest pieces of poetry in the entire biblical corpus, ancient enough and powerful enough that later editors specifically note in verse 18 that it was written down in the book of Jashar, a now lost collection of early Israelite poetry. The grief in this poem is real, and I want to spend a moment with it, because it tells us something about David that no military victory can. He has just been handed the political outcome he had been waiting for. The throne is now open, in a way it was not yesterday. And his first response is to write a poem about the man who tried to kill him. He orders it taught to the people of Judah. He wants it sung and remembered. There is something in that which goes beyond political calculation. No one becomes popular by writing grief songs for their predecessor when everyone knows they were enemies. David is doing something private and true and making it public because he believes it should be. The complexity of his relationship with Saul, the love and the threat, the loyalty and the survival, is all present in those lines, and David does not try to simplify it. He lets it be what it was. After the mourning, David does what he has learned to do throughout his years in the wilderness. He asks God what to do. The text in 2 Samuel chapter 2, verse 1 tells us this directly. David inquired of the Lord. He is not assuming the throne because the opportunity has arrived. He is asking for direction. God tells him to go up to Judah, and specifically to Hebron. So David goes, and his 2 wives, and his men and their families. And at Hebron, the men of Judah come, and they anoint David king over the house of Judah. This is the beginning, not the end, of David's path to the throne. He is king now, yes, but king over one tribe, in one city, in the south of the land. In the north, Saul's surviving commander Abner has installed Saul's son Ishbosheth as king over the rest of Israel. The kingdom is divided, and a long, difficult civil war is beginning, though David does not seek it. He is at Hebron, where Abraham once dwelt, where the ancient roots of his people go deep into the soil. He is in the right place. But the full kingdom is not yet his, and the road to Jerusalem is longer than anyone standing in Hebron on that day can fully see. I find the theological shape of this chapter genuinely striking when I step back from the details. God told Samuel at the beginning of all of this that Saul had been rejected. He told David through Nathan years later that the throne was coming. And then, when the moment arrived, it arrived through none of David's doing, through a battle he did not fight, in a region he was not present in, as the natural consequence of forces that had been building for years. David waited. He was faithful. He refused to manufacture the outcome even when he had the means to do so, and the outcome came to him. This is what the Deuteronomistic writers are trying to show their readers across the arc of these chapters, that God's purposes do not require human manipulation to succeed, and that the attempts to accelerate or control divine timing almost always create more damage than they prevent. Saul tried to hold on to what was leaving him. David waited for what was coming to him. The contrast, played out across a decade of wilderness and waiting, defines everything about how the ancient writers want their audience to understand both men. As we draw this chapter to a close, let the image of Hebron rest in your mind, the ancient city in the hills, the gathered men of Judah, the anointing oil once again, this time publicly and officially. David proclaimed king. But let the lament rest with you too. Let Jonathan's name rest in the air a little longer. The friendship that sustained David through his most dangerous years is gone. The man who believed in David before believing in David had consequences. Jonathan is on a mountain in the north, and David will carry that grief for the rest of his life. What is ahead is not simple or peaceful. There is a civil war to navigate, a divided kingdom to bring together, a new capital to choose and conquer. The throne of all Israel is still 7.5 years away, through struggle and grief and loss, but it is coming. And in our next chapter, I want to walk with you into the city that will become the center of everything, a Jebusite fortress on a hill that David will take and name his own, and transform into the place that three world religions still call holy today. We carry, sometimes, a simplified picture of how greatness arrives. We imagine a moment, a single turning point, where everything changes and the right person steps into the right role, and the world adjusts accordingly. But history, and certainly the history the books of Samuel give us, is almost never that clean. I want to sit with you in this chapter, in the long middle period of David's rise, the years between his anointing at Hebron over the tribe of Judah and his final recognition as king over all 12 tribes of Israel. This period covers roughly 7.5 years, according to the timeline the text gives us in 2 Samuel chapter 2, verses 10 and 11. And those years are not a victory march. They are a civil war, a political negotiation, a series of assassinations and betrayals and shifting alliances that David navigates with a combination of genuine principle and hard-won wisdom. And understanding this period is important because it shows us something true. The gap between being chosen and being established is where character is most severely tested. When David is anointed at Hebron over the house of Judah in 2 Samuel chapter 2 verse 4, he is not the first person to make a move in the power vacuum left by Saul's death. Abner, Saul's cousin and his commander of the army, a figure who has been present in the background of the Samuel narrative for several chapters, acts quickly and decisively. He takes Saul's surviving son, whose name appears in our text as Ishbosheth, and installs him as king over the northern tribes. The text in 2 Samuel chapter 2, verses 8 and 9, gives us the scope of Abner's arrangement. Ishbosheth is made king over Gilead, the Asherites, Jezreel, Ephraim, Benjamin, and all Israel. David, meanwhile, holds Judah in the south. The kingdom that Saul had unified, imperfectly and at great cost, is now split along lines of tribal loyalty and political calculation. And between these two kingdoms, war begins. Not the organized clash of armies on a single battlefield, but the grinding, ongoing, exhausting kind of conflict that the text describes in 2 Samuel chapter 3, verse 1. The war between the house of Saul and the house of David lasted a long time. David grew stronger and stronger, while the house of Saul grew weaker and weaker. The civil war does not begin with a major battle. It begins with a kind of arranged combat by the pool of Gibeon, described in 2 Samuel chapter 2, where 12 men from each side fight in what was apparently intended to be a representative contest. But instead of settling anything, they kill each other, all 24, the text seems to suggest. And the fighting spreads into a general battle. In the pursuit that follows, a man named Asahel, the brother of Joab, David's commander, and described as swift of foot as a wild gazelle, chases Abner and refuses to turn aside despite Abner's warnings. Abner kills him with the butt of his spear, reluctantly but definitively. This death plants a seed that will matter greatly later, because Joab does not forget it, and Joab is not the kind of man who lets things go. The pursuit eventually ends with a kind of mutual exhaustion. Abner calls out to Joab from across a valley and essentially asks how long before this ends. And Joab calls off the pursuit, but the blood has been drawn, the grievances have been established, and the underlying tension between the two camps continues. What I find remarkable about David's conduct during this civil war is how consistently the text presents him as reactive rather than aggressive. He does not send raiding parties north. He does not march on Mahanaim, where Ishbosheth holds court. He consolidates his position in Judah, conducts his affairs, and allows the northern kingdom's internal contradictions to work against themselves. And they do. The most significant of those contradictions is Abner himself. Ishbosheth accuses Abner of sleeping with one of Saul's concubines. a charge that, in the ancient world, carried enormous political weight, since access to a former king's women was a declaration of royal intention. Abner is furious at the accusation, and his response in 2 Samuel chapter 3, verses 9 and 10 is telling. He essentially declares that he will now transfer the kingdom from the house of Saul to David, fulfilling what he acknowledges the Lord swore. Whether Abner's sudden theological clarity reflects genuine conviction or wounded pride is something the text does not fully resolve. What it does tell us is that Abner sends messengers to David, and David receives them, and negotiations begin. David's condition for receiving Abner is specific and personal. He wants Michal, his first wife, the daughter of Saul, returned to him. She had been given by Saul to another man, Paltiel, son of Laish, after David's flight into the wilderness. 2 Samuel chapter 3, verse 15, records that Ishbosheth retrieves her, and verse 16 gives us one of the most quietly heartbreaking images in the entire narrative. Her husband Paltiel, walking behind her, weeping, all the way to Bahurim before Abner tells him to go back. Paltiel clearly loved her. What Michal felt, the text does not tell us. David wants her back, not merely out of personal affection, I think, but because her return carries political symbolism. She is Saul's daughter, and having her as his wife strengthens David's claim to legitimacy in the eyes of the northern tribes. There is a human story here, buried under the political one, and the ancient writer gives us just enough of it to feel its weight without fully exploring it. Abner comes to David at Hebron with 20 men, and David makes a feast for them. Everything seems to be moving toward resolution. Abner promises to gather all Israel to David, and he goes out to do exactly that. And then Joab returns from a raid, hears that Abner has been meeting with David, and is furious. He goes to David privately and questions the arrangement. Abner came to deceive you, he says in 2 Samuel 3, verse 25, to observe your movements and to find out everything you are doing. Whether Joab genuinely believes this, or is using it as justification for what he intends to do, is something the text leaves open. But what Joab does next is clear. He sends messengers after Abner, recalls him to Hebron on a pretext, takes him aside at the city gate, and stabs him in the stomach. He kills him. Asahel avenged, rival eliminated. The diplomatic process that was approaching resolution brought to a sudden and violent halt. And David's response, when he finds out, is immediate and public. He curses Joab, commands everyone to tear their clothes and mourn, and walks behind Abner's coffin himself. He laments over Abner at the graveside. Should Abner have died as the lawless die? He asks in verse 33. And he weeps, and the people notice, and the text tells us in verse 37 that all the people took note and were pleased, because everything the king did pleased them. David is managing the political damage of Joab's act with genuine grief and public mourning, and the people can see the difference. Ishbosheth, hearing of Abner's death, loses his courage. The text in 2 Samuel chapter 4, verse 1 says he became feeble, and all Israel was alarmed. 2 of his own officers, Baanah and Rechab, from the tribe of Benjamin, break into his house at midday while he is taking his noonday rest, stab him, cut off his head, and bring it to David at Hebron. They expect a reward. They frame their act as divine justice. And David's response follows exactly the pattern he established with the Amalekite messenger who claimed to have killed Saul. He asks them, rhetorically, whether they think it was a good thing to kill a righteous man in his own house, on his own bed. He has them executed, their hands and feet cut off, and their bodies hung by the pool of Hebron. Their heads are buried, Once again, twice more in this chapter alone, David publicly and formally distances himself from the deaths of Saul's house. Every time an opportunity arises for David to benefit from violence against his predecessors, he condemns it. By the time the northern elders finally come to Hebron in 2 Samuel chapter 5, the record is clear. David's hands are clean of Saul's blood, clean of Jonathan's blood, clean of Abner's blood, clean of Ishbosheth's blood. Whatever else might be said of him, no one can say he climbed over their bodies. The moment recorded in 2 Samuel chapter 5, verses 1 through 3, is quiet but enormous. All the tribes of Israel come to David at Hebron. They say to him, "We are your own flesh and blood." They acknowledge that even when Saul was king, it was David who led Israel on their military campaigns. And they invoke what they understand to be a divine promise. "The Lord said to you, 'You will shepherd my people Israel, and you will become their ruler.'" Notice the word they use, shepherd. Not warrior, not strategist, not politician. Shepherd. The elders of Israel are reaching back to what David was before any of this, and they are saying, "You were always this." David makes a covenant with them before the Lord in Hebron, and they anoint him king over Israel. He is 30 years old, the text tells us in verse 4. He has waited 17 years, roughly, since Samuel poured oil over him in Bethlehem. 17 years of wilderness and caves and spears and exile and civil war and patience that must have tested every belief he had. And now, in a single moment, in a city his ancestor Abraham once knew, the waiting is over. What I want to reflect on theologically as we stand at this moment is how the ancient writers understood what had just happened. In the Deuteronomistic framework that shapes these books, the outcome at Hebron is not the result of David's political skill, though he clearly had it. It is not the result of his military prowess, though that was real. It is the fulfillment of what God set in motion when Samuel poured oil over a shepherd boy in a back room in Bethlehem, while the rest of the family was gathered in the main hall. The people of Israel, coming to David with their covenant offer, are the human instrument through which a divine decision arrives at its appointed time. P. Kyle MacArthur Jr., whose Anchor Bible commentary on 1 Samuel is one of the most careful scholarly treatments of this material, he has written about the way the entire arc of these narratives is shaped to legitimate David's kingship, showing at every turn that he neither sought nor engineered what came to him. This is the theological portrait the ancient writers were painting, and it is internally consistent across many chapters of complex and sometimes uncomfortable narrative. As we move toward the close of this chapter, I want you to feel the weight of what the men at Hebron just did, and what David just accepted. A covenant, not just a political arrangement, but a binding agreement before the Lord, has been made between a king and a people. David is shepherd and ruler both. The tribal confederacy that demanded a king back in 1 Samuel 8 has now given its consent to the specific man God chose. And that man, older now, tested beyond most of us can imagine, scarred by years of wilderness and loss, has accepted the full weight of what he was always being prepared for. The 7 years of waiting at Hebron are over. The 17 years since Bethlehem have led here. What comes next is a capital city, a new center for a unified kingdom, a place that will become so significant that it is still being contested and revered and mourned over 3,000 years later. Jerusalem is waiting, and in our next chapter, I want to take you there, to the Jebusite fortress on the hill, to the sound of a city being taken and renamed, to the moment David's kingdom finds its permanent address. There is a city that has been standing, in one form or another, for thousands of years. A city that sits on a ridge of limestone hills in the central highlands of ancient Canaan, surrounded by valleys on three sides, commanding views in every direction. People have been living there, fighting over it, mourning it, singing about it, and building on top of its ruins for longer than almost any other continuously inhabited place on earth. I want to take you there tonight, not to the Jerusalem of modern headlines or ancient controversy, but to a specific moment in time, around the year 1000 BCE, when a king named David looked at that ridge and its Jebusite fortress and decided that this was where everything would change. The choice of Jerusalem as a capital was not an obvious one. It was not the largest city in the region. It was not the traditional center of any of the 12 tribes. And that, I think, was precisely the point. What David saw in Jerusalem was not just a defensible position on high ground. He saw a city that belonged to no tribe and therefore could belong to all of them, a neutral ground on which a unified nation could be built. Let me walk you through what the ancient texts and the archaeologists have uncovered about what happened when David arrived at that hill. The Jebusites were the people who held Jerusalem before David, and the biblical text in 2 Samuel chapter 5 traces a connection between this city and a place called Salem that appears even earlier in the story of Abraham in Genesis. But in David's time, it was firmly Jebusite territory, a fortified settlement on the ridge that the texts call Zion, surrounded by the Kidron Valley to the east, the Hinnom Valley to the west and south, and the Tyropoeon Valley to the northwest. The Amarna letters, a collection of diplomatic correspondence from the 14th century BCE, mention a city called Jerusalem, a name most scholars identify with Jerusalem, showing that this settlement was already significant enough to be part of the political conversation of the ancient Near East 6 centuries before David. Archaeological surveys of the site confirm occupation stretching back even further into the Bronze Age and beyond. So when David approaches this city, he is approaching something that has been inhabited and fortified and fought over for a very long time. He is not discovering an empty hill. He is taking something that already exists and making it something new. The Jebusite response to David's approach is recorded in 2 Samuel chapter 5 verse 6 with a confidence that reads almost like taunting. The Jebusites say to David, "You will not get in here. Even the blind and the lame can ward you off." This is an interesting phrase, and scholars have puzzled over it for centuries. The most straightforward reading is that the Jebusites were so confident in their fortifications that they were essentially mocking David. Our city is so well defended that we could put our most vulnerable people on the walls and still keep you out. There is a possible alternate reading that some scholars suggest involves the use of figures representing ancestors or guardian spirits at the walls. But this interpretation is genuinely disputed, and I would not want to present it as settled. What is clear is that the Jebusites did not think David could take their city. They were wrong, and the reason they were wrong is connected to a single word in verse 8 that has generated centuries of commentary, the word tsinor. David says in 2 Samuel chapter 5 verse 8 that whoever attacks the Jebusites should get up the tsinor to reach those whom David's soul hates, meaning the blind and the lame. The word tsinor is one of the most discussed terms in the entire David narrative. It appears only this once in the Hebrew Bible in this context, and its precise meaning is genuinely uncertain. Many translations render it as water shaft, leading to the identification of David's entry point with what archaeologists call Warren's shaft, a vertical tunnel connected to a water system that was discovered beneath the city of David in the 19th century by the British engineer Charles Warren. The idea that David's forces used this water channel to enter the city from below is deeply embedded in popular imagination and in many historical presentations. But I want to be honest with you. The identification of the Tulsinor with Warren's shaft and the interpretation of this verse as describing an assault through a water tunnel is far from certain. The archaeology of the shaft system has been re-examined, and some recent work suggests Warren's shaft may post-date David's time, or that it was not accessible in the way the popular theory suggests. This remains an actively disputed area, and the honest answer is that we do not know exactly how David took Jerusalem. The text tells us he took it and that the Tinor was involved. The precise mechanism is something the ancient writer apparently assumed the original audience already knew. What happens after the conquest is told in 2 Samuel chapter 5, with a kind of measured momentum that I find characteristic of the ancient writers at their best. David takes the stronghold of Zion, which from this point forward the text calls the City of David, and he builds up the area around it from the terraces inward. And then comes a detail that carries enormous historical and diplomatic weight. Hiram, king of Tyre, sends messengers to David and cedar logs and carpenters and stonemasons, and they build David a palace. Hiram of Tyre was the king of one of the great Phoenician city-states on the Lebanese coast, and Phoenician craftsmen were among the most skilled architects and builders in the entire ancient world. The fact that Hiram reaches out to David unprompted, or if not unprompted, then willingly, is a signal to the ancient reader that David's kingdom is being recognized by the powers of the region. This is not a local chieftain consolidating a small territory. This is a king whose existence is being acknowledged by the sophisticated commercial empire of the Phoenicians. The cedar palace that results from this collaboration becomes David's primary residence in Jerusalem, the fixed point of his royal administration. Now, I want to spend a moment with the archaeological conversation around David's Jerusalem, because it is genuinely important and genuinely complicated. Eilat Mazar, the Israeli archaeologist who conducted excavations at the summit of the city of David, beginning in 2005, she believed she had found evidence of a large administrative structure from the 10th century BCE, a building she identified as potentially the remains of David's palace, or at minimum, a significant royal structure from the period. Her identification of what she called the large stone structure with the palace described in 2 Samuel 5 generated considerable excitement and considerable scholarly debate. Other archaeologists, including Israel Finkelstein of Tel Aviv University, argued that Mazar's dating was problematic and that the evidence for a significant administrative center in 10th century Jerusalem was far more limited than she claimed. Finkelstein and his colleague Neil Asher Silberman, in their book David and Solomon, argued that the Jerusalem of David's time was likely a small highland town rather than the capital of a significant empire. This debate between what scholars call the maximalist and minimalist positions on the historical David is ongoing and is one of the most important conversations in current biblical archaeology. I want you to know about it honestly, because presenting one side as settled fact would not serve you well. What both sides of that scholarly conversation agree on is that Jerusalem became something significant over time, and that the biblical tradition consistently and powerfully connects that significance to David. The theological development that flows from this connection is sometimes called Zion theology, and it runs through the Psalms with remarkable richness. Psalms 46, 48, and 76 all celebrate Zion as the dwelling place of God, the city where the divine presence has chosen to rest. the mountain that no enemy can ultimately overwhelm. Psalm 46, verse 4, speaks of a river whose streams make glad the city of God, the holy place where the Most High dwells. Psalm 48, verse 2, calls Zion the city of the great King, beautiful in elevation, the joy of all the earth. These psalms, regardless of their precise dates of composition, reflect a theological conviction that took root in the Davidic period and grew over centuries into one of the most enduring ideas in all of Israelite religion: that God chose Jerusalem the way he chose David, not because of its outward greatness, but because of his own purposes. Here is what I find genuinely remarkable when I hold the archaeology and the theology together, even with all their tensions and uncertainties. Whether David's Jerusalem was a large administrative center or a more modest highland settlement, the idea that was born there, the idea of a city where the human and the divine meet, where the covenant between God and his people has a physical address, has proven to be one of the most durable ideas in human history. Jerusalem has been conquered, destroyed, rebuilt, divided, reunified, mourned over, and sung about by three of the world's major religious traditions for 3 millennia. Whatever the archaeologists eventually conclude about the 10th century, the meaning that David gave to that ridge, or the meaning that God, in the theological understanding of the ancient writers, chose to attach to it through David, has outlasted every empire that has ever tried to claim it or erase it. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, something quite extraordinary. As we draw this chapter toward its close, I want you to sit for a moment with the image of David on that ridge, looking out over the city he has just taken. Behind him are the years in the wilderness, the caves, the civil war, the long waiting. Before him is a city that is about to become something the world has never quite seen before. A capital, a sanctuary, a symbol. He is going to fill it with life and purpose, and eventually with the presence of God in a way that transforms it from a Jebusite fortress into something sacred. His palace is being built with Phoenician cedar. His throne is being established. And yet the most important thing he wants to bring into this city is not yet here. It is sitting in a tent in the hills, the Ark of the Covenant, the chest of acacia wood, overlaid with gold that represented, in Israelite theology, the very throne of God on earth. David wants the Ark in Jerusalem. He wants his city and his God to be in the same place. And the story of how he tries to bring it there, and what happens on the way, and what erupts between him and Michal in the courtyard, and what God says to him afterward about the future, that is the story we carry into our next chapter. Let me take you to a procession, not a military parade with weapons and armor, and the sound of marching feet in formation, but something looser, wilder, more joyful and more dangerous than that. Imagine thousands of people moving through the Judean hills, singing, shouting, playing instruments of every kind, harps and lyres, tambourines and castanets and cymbals, trumpets announcing what is coming. And at the center of this procession, carried on poles by consecrated priests, a golden chest that Israel believed was the footstool of God himself. This is the scene that the 6th chapter of 2 Samuel places before us, and it is one of the most vivid and theologically loaded scenes in the entire David narrative. There is joy in it, and reverence, and sudden death, and humiliation, and dancing. David dancing with everything he has in a linen ephod before the Lord, with the whole house of Israel joining him. And at the end of the day, when the ark is settled in Jerusalem and the celebrations are over, King David comes home to bless his household and is met by the cold fury of his wife. I want to walk through all of it with you slowly, because each piece of it carries something true. Before we get to the procession itself, I need to tell you about what happened the first time David tried to bring the ark to Jerusalem, because it did not go the way he planned. The ark had been sitting in a place called Kiriath Jearim, in the house of a man named Abinadab, for 20 years, since the Philistines had captured it and then returned it after a series of disasters that convinced them they did not want it. David assembles 30,000 chosen men, and they go to bring the ark up. They put it on a new cart, which sounds careful and honorable, and perhaps to David's mind it was, pulled by oxen, driven by Abinadab's sons, Uzzah and Ahio. The procession begins. People are celebrating before the Lord with songs and lyres and harps and tambourines and castanets and cymbals. And then the oxen stumble, and Uzzah reaches out his hand to steady the ark, and the Lord's anger burns against him, and he dies there beside the ark, immediately, on the spot. And David is both angry and afraid, and the whole procession stops. The death of Uzzah has troubled readers for a very long time, and I do not want to move past it too quickly. It feels, to modern sensibility, deeply unjust. A man reflexively reaches out to prevent the sacred object from falling, and he dies for it. The ancient Israelite understanding, grounded in the priestly traditions of the Torah, was that the ark was not to be touched by unauthorized hands under any circumstances. The prescribed method of transporting it, laid out in Numbers chapter 4, involved carrying it on poles by consecrated Levites, never on a cart, never touched directly. David, in his enthusiasm, had skipped the prescribed procedure. The new cart may have seemed like an honorable innovation, but in the logic of Israelite holiness theology, the intention behind an action does not override the requirement of the action itself. The holiness of God, in this understanding, is not negotiable by human good intentions. Whether you find that theology comfortable or not, it is consistent within its own framework, and the ancient writer is not asking you to find it comfortable, only to recognize what it reveals about the nature of what David is dealing with. After Uzzah's death, David leaves the ark at the house of a man named Obed-Edom, the Gittite, and it stays there for 3 months, during which the text tells us in 2 Samuel chapter 6, verse 11, that the Lord blesses Obed-Edom and his whole household. When David hears about Obed-Edom's blessing, he goes back for the ark, but this time he does it differently. The text does not go into detail about the procedural corrections he makes, but the parallel account in 1 Chronicles chapter 15 is explicit that David learned from the first attempt, and this time had the Levites carry the ark on their shoulders with poles, as the law prescribed. And the second procession is different in character from the first. It is still celebratory, but there is a new element. Every 6 steps, the procession stops, and David sacrifices an ox and a fattened calf. Every 6 steps. Think about what that means for the pace and the feel of this procession. It is not a march, not a parade, but a slow, sacred, intermittent movement toward the city, punctuated again and again by sacrifice and worship. And in the middle of all of this, the text gives us its most memorable image: David wearing a linen ephod, a priestly garment, not a royal robe, dancing before the Lord with all his might. The phrase in 2 Samuel chapter 6, verse 14, is vivid and physical, makaka in Hebrew, a word that suggests whirling, leaping, celebrating without restraint. This is not a dignified processional step. David is moving with everything he has. Here is where the day's joy takes its unexpected turn. As the ark enters Jerusalem to the sound of shouting and trumpets, as the whole house of Israel processes with David at its center, Someone is watching from a window. Michal, the daughter of Saul and David's wife, looks down from above and sees David leaping and dancing. And the text in 2 Samuel chapter 6, verse 16 says something precise and deliberate. She despised him in her heart. She has not spoken yet. David has not come home yet. The celebration continues. The ark is placed in the tent David has prepared for it. He offers burnt offerings and peace offerings. He blesses the people in the name of the Lord, and he distributes food to every person in the whole assembly of Israel. Bread and a portion of meat and a raisin cake. And then he goes home to bless his household. And Michal comes out to meet him. She says in verse 20, how the king of Israel has distinguished himself today, uncovering himself today in the sight of the slaves of his servants, as any vulgar fellow might shamelessly uncover himself. She is furious and she is cutting. The dancing, the linen ephod, in her eyes it was undignified, beneath the standard of a king, a public humiliation performed before the eyes of servants and common people. David's response to Michal is one of the most direct and unapologetic things he says in the entire narrative. He tells her in verses 21 and 22 that his dancing was before the Lord, the God who chose him over her father and over all of Saul's house, and that he will celebrate before the Lord, and he will humiliate himself even more than this, and he will be humbled in his own eyes, and the servant girls she mentioned will honor him for it. He is not apologizing. He is not explaining himself away or softening his position. He is saying, what I did, and I did for God, and I will do it again. The text closes the episode with a single devastating line in verse 23. Michal, daughter of Saul, had no children to the day of her death. Whether this is presented as a divine judgment for her contempt, or as a natural consequence of the estrangement between her and David, or simply as a sad biographical fact, the ancient writer places it here without commentary and leaves the weight of it hanging in the air. The woman who despised David's worship died without the children that would have given her legacy and security in that ancient world. After the ark is in Jerusalem, settled in its tent, David turns his attention to something that has been on his mind. He is living in a palace of cedar, while the ark of God is in a tent. He says this to the prophet Nathan, and Nathan's immediate response is to encourage him. Do whatever is in your heart, he says in 2 Samuel chapter 7 verse 3, for the Lord is with you. But that night, God speaks to Nathan and corrects him. And Nathan has to go back to David the next morning with a message that is both a refusal and a promise simultaneously. God says, through Nathan, you will not build me a house. I have never asked for a house. I have been moving with my people in a tent and a tabernacle, and I have not asked any of the judges of Israel to build me a cedar house. But then God pivots, and what comes next is the theological center of the entire David story. God says in 2 Samuel chapter 7, verses 11 through 16, I will make you a house. Your son will build the temple. Your throne will be established forever. I will be his father, and he will be my son. And even if he sins, my love will never be taken from him the way I took it from Saul. Your house and your kingdom will endure forever before me. Your throne will be established forever. This promise, the Davidic covenant, as scholars call it, is one of the foundational documents of messianic theology across all three Abrahamic faiths, and I want to sit with its significance for a moment. In the Jewish tradition, this covenant becomes the basis for the hope of a Davidic king who will restore Israel's sovereignty and inaugurate an age of peace and justice, the messianic hope that runs through the prophetic literature from Isaiah to Zechariah. In the Christian tradition, the New Testament reads this covenant as finding its fulfillment in Jesus of Nazareth, whom the Gospel writers present as the Son of David. Matthew's genealogy opens with precisely this identification in chapter 1, verse 1, the Son of David, the Son of Abraham. In the Islamic tradition, Dawood, David, is recognized as a prophet and king, and his covenant with God is understood within the broader framework of divine guidance to humanity's appointed leaders. Frank Moore Cross, the great Harvard scholar of Canaanite myth and Hebrew epic, wrote extensively about the Davidic covenant as a royal theology that drew on ancient Near Eastern models of divine adoption of the king, while transforming them into something distinctly Israelite. Whether you come to this passage from any of those traditions or from none of them, the scope of what is being promised here is remarkable. Not just a dynasty, but a permanent relationship between God and a lineage, with consequences still unfolding millennia later. Now, I want to be honest with you about one of the genuine theological tensions embedded in this covenant, because the text holds it, and we should too. The promise in 2 Samuel chapter 7 sounds unconditional. The throne will be established forever. The love will not be taken away. But other passages complicate this. 1 Kings chapter 2, verse 4, records David himself telling Solomon that the condition for the dynasty's continuation is that Solomon and his descendants walk faithfully before the Lord with all their heart and soul. Psalm 132, verse 12, puts it similarly. If your sons keep my covenant and the statutes I teach them, then their sons will sit on your throne forever. So is the covenant unconditional or conditional? Scholars across centuries have not fully resolved this question, and I think that is significant. The ancient writers seem to have held both possibilities at once, trusting that the tension itself was meaningful. What is not in dispute is the central claim. God has made a commitment to David and his line that goes beyond the ordinary dynamics of political power. Whatever the conditions, whatever the consequences of disobedience, this relationship is real and its implications are vast. As we draw this chapter toward its close, I want to hold together the three moments we have moved through: the failed first procession and Uzzah's death, the dancing and Michal's contempt, and the Davidic covenant in the quiet after the celebration. What strikes me about the way these three scenes sit together is the fullness they represent. Here is the whole human and divine encounter in miniature. Good intentions meeting unexpected danger, uninhibited worship meeting human pride, a king's desire to honor God meeting God's own redirection towards something larger than the king had imagined. David wanted to build God a house. God said no, and then said, I will build you one. What is being built is not cedar and stone, but something more durable, a lineage, a covenant, a thread of divine commitment that will run forward through history in ways that neither David nor Nathan could fully see on the night Nathan delivered the message. And I find something quietly comforting in that. The recognition that God's purposes often arrive sideways, through refusals and redirections, and the patient working out of commitments made in private tents and in the dark after everyone else has gone home. Now we are standing on the other side of the covenant, and the city is settled, and the ark is in its tent, and the cedar palace stands on the hill. Everything that comes before in David's story has been preparation and arrival. What comes next is the thing the narrative has been quietly warning us about. Not an enemy from outside, not a Philistine army or a jealous king, but something that rises from within David himself, on a night when he should have been at war and instead was walking on his rooftop. The height of David's power and the beginning of his most consequential moral failure are separated by a single evening, a single rooftop, a single glance across the city he built. In our next chapter, I want to sit with you in that moment, carefully, honestly, with the reverence that both the text and the human beings involved deserve. There are stories that are told quietly, without dramatic music or visible warning signs, that carry more weight than all the battles and kingdoms and covenants that surround them. This is one of those stories. The 11th chapter of 2 Samuel begins with a single sentence that the ancient storyteller delivers almost as an aside, but that functions as the hinge of David's entire life. In the spring, at the time when kings go off to war, David sent Joab out with the king's men and the whole Israelite army. They destroyed the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah, but David remained in Jerusalem. That last sentence, "but David remained in Jerusalem," is doing enormous work. It tells us, without saying so explicitly, that David is somewhere he should not be. The spring was campaign season. Kings led their armies. David, for reasons the text does not explain, stayed home. And from that decision, from that staying home, from that evening walk on a rooftop while his army was fighting in his name, everything that follows comes. I want to walk through this chapter with you, gently but honestly, because the text itself is honest, and it deserves that from us. Before we move into the events themselves, let me give you a little of the historical context that surrounds this chapter, because I think it helps. The text tells us in 2 Samuel chapter 11, verse 3, that the woman David sees is named Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam and the wife of Uriah the Hittite. The mention of Uriah as a Hittite is historically interesting. The Hittites, as we noted much earlier in our story, were a significant ancient Near Eastern people, and by David's time, Hittites were present in Canaan as both mercenaries and integrated community members. Uriah's name itself, which in Hebrew contains the divine name Yah, suggests that he had fully adopted Israelite religious identity. He is not a foreigner in the sense of being an outsider to Israel's world. He is a dedicated soldier, a member of David's elite fighting force, a man whose loyalty to his king and to his people is displayed with painful irony in the very scene where David is trying to use him. Archaeological and historical evidence confirms the presence of Hittite individuals in Levantine communities during the Iron Age II period, lending background texture to the specificity of the text's description. Tikva Freimer Kensky, the scholar of women in the Hebrew Bible, has written carefully about Bathsheba's position in this narrative, and I want to hold what she observes close to what the text actually says. The sequence of events in 2 Samuel chapter 11 is told with remarkable economy and no editorializing from the narrator. David is on his rooftop in the evening. He sees a woman bathing. She is very beautiful. He sends someone to find out who she is. He is told she is Bathsheba, the wife of Uriah the Hittite, one of his soldiers. David sends messengers and takes her. She comes to him. He sleeps with her. She returns to her house. And then, in verse 5, a message arrives. She is pregnant. The entire encounter is described in these spare, sequential lines. And what I want you to notice is what is completely absent from them. Bathsheba speaks once to send the message about the pregnancy. She is given no desire, no motivation, no voice, no agency in the text. She does not seek David out. She does not scheme. She is sent for, taken, and sent back. Many scholars today, including Freimer Kensky, have written about how this power dynamic, a king with messengers and authority, a woman who cannot refuse the summons of a monarch, makes this an act of royal coercion rather than a mutual encounter. The text does not use the language of rape, but it does not describe consent either. I want to hold this honestly, because modern readers deserve to engage with the full weight of what the ancient writers recorded, not a sanitized version. What David does next is where the story moves from moral failure to something worse. He calls Uriah back from the battlefield, ostensibly to give a report on the war, but in reality to give him the opportunity to sleep with his own wife, which would cover the pregnancy with a plausible explanation. Uriah comes. David speaks with him about the campaign, and then tells him to go home and rest. And Uriah does not go home. He sleeps at the entrance to the palace with the king's servants. When David finds out, he asks Uriah why he did not go to his house. And Uriah's response in 2 Samuel chapter 11, verses 11 through 12, is one of the most quietly devastating pieces of dialogue in the entire narrative. He says, "The ark and Israel and Judah are staying in tents. Shji and my commander, Joab, and my lord's men are camped in the open country. How could I go to my house to eat and drink and make love to my wife? As surely as you live, I will not do such a thing." Uriah is the most honorable person in this scene. The man David is trying to manipulate is protecting David from the very scrutiny that David has brought on himself, refusing personal comfort out of solidarity with his fellow soldiers, observing military purity requirements that the commander who sent him home has completely abandoned. David tries again the next night. He invites Uriah to dinner and makes him drunk. And still, Uriah does not go home. He sleeps among the king's servants again. At this point, David makes the decision that the ancient writer records with a directness that leaves no room for ambiguity. He writes a letter to Joab, his military commander in the field, and sends it by Uriah's hand. The letter says, "Put Uriah out in front where the fighting is fiercest, then withdraw from him, so he will be struck down and die." Uriah carries his own death warrant to the front. Joab follows the instructions. Uriah the Hittite is killed in battle before the walls of Rabbah. A messenger is sent to David with the battle report, and David's response to the news of Uriah's death is recorded in verse 25, with a casualness that is chilling. "Tell Joab, don't let this upset you. Don't let this upset you." And then he tells Joab to press the attack and encourage him. The chapter closes with Bathsheba mourning her husband, and then David sending for her and taking her into the palace as his wife. And the final line of the chapter is this: "But the thing David had done displeased the Lord." Into this situation walks a prophet named Nathan. And what Nathan does in 2 Samuel chapter 12 is a masterpiece of moral confrontation. He does not walk into the palace and accuse the king directly, which would have been dangerous and likely ineffective. He tells a story. He says to David, "There were two men in a city, one rich and one poor. The rich man had many flocks and herds. The poor man had nothing but one little ewe lamb, which he had raised from birth. It was like a daughter to him. A traveller came to visit the rich man, and the rich man, instead of taking from his own flock, took the poor man's lamb and prepared it for his guest." When Nathan finishes this story, David's response is immediate and furious. "As the Lord lives," he says in verse 5, "the man who did this deserves to die. He shall restore the lamb fourfold because he did this thing and had no pity." David is so morally outraged at the fictional rich man that he pronounces his own condemnation. And then Nathan says to him, in the most famous 3 words of this entire chapter, "You are the man." Uriah is the poor man. Bathsheba is the lamb. David is the rich man who took what was not his. And Nathan knows, and now David knows that Nathan knows, and the confrontation is complete. Nathan's speech that follows in 2 Samuel chapter 12, verses 7 through 12, does not let David off easily. He reminds David of everything God had given him, the anointing, the house of Saul, the kingdom, the wives, and the promise that more would have been given if this had not been enough. And he announces the consequences. Because David used the sword of the Ammonites to kill Uriah, the sword shall never depart from his house. Because David did this in secret, what he is about to experience will happen in broad daylight before all Israel. And the child that Bathsheba is carrying will die. David's response, when Nathan finishes, is 3 words in the Hebrew that translate as, "I have sinned against the Lord." Nathan tells him, "The Lord has put away your sin, you will not die." But then Nathan reiterates the consequences, because by this act David has given occasion for the enemies of God to blaspheme. The child will die. And the child is struck ill, and David fasts and lies on the ground for 7 days, refusing to rise, refusing to eat, praying for the child's life. On the 7th day, the child dies, and David, when he learns this, gets up, washes, puts on lotions, changes his clothes, goes to the house of the Lord and worships, and then asks for food and eats. His servants are bewildered. While the child was alive, you fasted. Now that the child is dead, you get up and eat. And David says, "While the child was alive, I fasted and wept, because I thought, who knows whether the Lord may be gracious to me? But now that he is dead, why should I fast? Can I bring him back again?" I want to pause here and say something about how the psalm tradition has always connected to this passage, because I think it matters. The 51st Psalm, one of the most beloved and widely prayed texts in all of the Hebrew Bible, carries a title that places it in the context of Nathan's confrontation. A Psalm of David, the heading reads, "When the prophet Nathan came to him after he had gone in to Bathsheba." The opening lines of that psalm are among the most raw and honest in all of ancient literature. "Have mercy on me, O God, according to your unfailing love. According to your great compassion, blot out my transgressions. Wash away all my iniquity and cleanse me from my sin. For I know my transgressions, and my sin is always before me." Now, I want to be honest with you, as I try to be throughout this telling, about what we know and what we hold with some uncertainty. The connection of Psalm 51 to this specific event is traditional rather than definitively historical. The psalm titles were added at some point in the editorial history of the Psalter, and scholars debate the precise relationship between psalm headings and original composition contexts. What I can say is that the emotional content of Psalm 51 fits this moment with an intimacy that is hard to read as entirely coincidental. Whether David wrote it in the direct aftermath of Nathan's visit, or whether it was composed later in that tradition, these words of broken contrition have given language to human guilt and divine mercy for 3,000 years. The theological reflection I want to offer on this chapter is simple and I hope honest. David's fall is not the fall of a bad man. That is actually what makes it so serious and so resonant across time. Bad men doing bad things is a story with a comprehensible shape. What 2 Samuel 11 and 12 gives us is something harder. A genuinely good man, chosen by God, marked by the Spirit, author of some of the most beautiful worship poetry in human history, and doing something genuinely terrible. And the text does not resolve this by making him less than he was before, or by making the terrible thing less than it was. It holds both. It holds the anointing and the murder order in the same hands. It holds the dancing before the ark and the letter to Joab in the same life. Scholars like Walter Brueggemann have written about how this passage is one of the most theologically serious in all of the Hebrew Bible, precisely because of this refusal to simplify. David is not let off the hook. The consequences Nathan announces will unfold across the rest of his life with terrible accuracy. And he is not destroyed. God's covenant with him holds. Bathsheba's second son is born and named Solomon, and the line continues. Grace and consequence, both real. She both held together without either one cancelling the other out. As we come toward the end of this chapter, I want you to hold the image of Nathan walking away from David's palace after their confrontation. The prophet has done what he came to do. He has named the truth, announced the consequences, and received the king's confession. And now David has to live inside the aftermath of what he has done. The sword will not depart from his house. The text says this, and the text means it, and the chapters that follow will prove it. There is a son whose name is Amnon, and there is a daughter whose name is Tamar, and there is another son whose name is Absalom, and the violence that Nathan promised is already, invisibly, taking shape in the relationships between them. David's private sin will become a very public and very bloody tragedy. The family that his choices have wounded will express that wounding in ways that shake his throne to its foundation. But before we go there, before we follow the sword's path through David's own household, we will rest in this moment of confession, in the mercy that Nathan announces even alongside the judgment, and let the weight of it settle quietly. There are wounds in a family that do not announce themselves immediately. They settle into the structure of relationships the way water settles into stone, quietly, invisibly, and then, over time, they split what seemed solid. I want to take you into the most painful chapter of David's life as a father tonight. A chapter that unfolds across several years and several chapters of 2 Samuel. She moving from a terrible act of violence within his own household, to a civil war driven by his own son, to a flight from Jerusalem that would have broken most people entirely. Nathan told David that the sword would not depart from his house. In these chapters, we watch that prophecy take its slow and devastating shape, not through enemies from outside, but through the people who shared his blood, who grew up in his palace, who bore his name. This is not a simple story of rebellion and punishment. It is a story about what happens when a father fails to act and what that failure costs everyone around him. Let me walk through it with you carefully, because the text is careful about it, and it deserves that. The sequence begins with a crime that sits at the heart of everything that follows. David had many sons by many wives, and among them were two named Amnon and Absalom, both of them significant figures in the royal household. Amnon was the eldest, the heir apparent. Absalom was the third son, born of a different mother, and the text in 2 Samuel chapter 14, verse 25 will later describe him as the most handsome man in all Israel, without blemish from head to foot. They had a half-sister named Tamar, Absalom's full sister, and 2 Samuel chapter 13 describes her as beautiful. What the ancient writer records in 2 Samuel chapter 13, verses 1 through 20, is an account of Amnon's obsession with Tamar, how it was counseled by a cousin named Jonadab, who is described as very crafty, how Amnon feigns illness and asks David to send Tamar to care for him, how she comes and prepares food for him, and how he forces himself on her despite her explicit resistance. She says to him, recorded in verses 12 and 13, "No, my brother, do not force me, for such a thing is not done in Israel. Do not do this outrageous thing." She even proposes an alternative. "Speak to the king," she says, "and he will not withhold me from you." Amnon refuses to listen. After he has raped her, the text says in verse 15 that he hated her with a very great hatred, greater than the love with which he had loved her. He sends her away. She goes to live desolate in Absalom's house. What David does when he hears about this is recorded in a single verse, 2 Samuel chapter 13, verse 21, and it is one of the most troubling silences in the entire narrative. When King David heard of all these things, he was very angry. Angry. That is all. The text gives us his emotional reaction, and nothing else. No action, no justice, no confrontation of Amnon, no support for Tamar, no consequence for what his eldest son has done in his own household. Robert Alter, whose translation and commentary on the David story is one of the most careful modern engagements with this text, has noted that some ancient manuscripts add a line here explaining that David did not punish Amnon because he loved him, for he was his firstborn. Even if that addition is authentic, it does not redeem the inaction. It only explains it. David's failure here is not the failure of a monster. It is the failure of a father who cannot bring himself to confront the son he loves, a man whose own moral authority has been compromised by his own history, who perhaps does not know how to judge behavior in others that he cannot fully face in himself. Whatever the explanation, the cost of his silence is enormous, and Absalom is watching. Absalom says nothing to Amnon, good or bad, the text tells us in verse 22, for 2 full years. He is waiting, and then he acts. He prepares a sheep-shearing celebration, invites all the king's sons, and instructs his servants in advance. When Amnon is drunk, kill him. His servants do it. All the other sons flee on their mules. A confused report reaches David that Absalom has killed all his sons, and David tears his garments and lies on the ground in grief. But then a more accurate account arrives. Jonadab, the crafty cousin, tells David that it is only Amnon who is dead. Absalom flees to Geshur, the land of his maternal grandfather. His mother was the daughter of the king of Geshur, and he stays there for 3 years. David, the text says in verse 39, longed to go to Absalom, for he was comforted concerning Amnon since he was dead. He misses his son, the son who killed his son. The emotional complexity here is genuine. This is grief and love and loss all tangled together in the way they always are in real family tragedy, without any of it being neat or resoluble. Joab, David's general, the man who seems to always be operating somewhere in the background of these events, perceives that David's heart is toward Absalom. He arranges for a wise woman from Tekoa to come to David and tell him a fictional story about a widow whose one son has killed the other, and whose clan now demands the surviving son's life, which would leave her with no heir and no legacy. David is moved by her story and pledges to protect the fictional son, and then the woman turns the parable on David directly. Why have you not brought your own banished son home? She asks in 2 Samuel chapter 14, verse 13. When you have said something like this against God's people. The structure is the same as Nathan's parable years earlier. A story that leads the king to pronounce a judgment and then reveals that the judgment applies to himself. Joab is the architect behind this confrontation. Absalom is allowed to return to Jerusalem, though initially he is not allowed to see the king's face. He lives 2 years in Jerusalem without seeing David. Finally, Absalom, frustrated, she burns Joab's barley field to get his attention because Joab refused to come when called, and demands through Joab to see the king. David allows it. Absalom comes and bows down before the king. David kisses him. The reconciliation appears to be complete. But something in Absalom has shifted permanently. What Absalom does next is described in 2 Samuel chapter 15, verses 1 through 6, with a deliberateness that reads like a systematic political campaign. He gets himself a chariot and horses and 50 men to run ahead of him. He rises early and stands by the city gate, intercepting anyone who has a legal case to bring before the king. He draws them into conversation, hears their grievance, and says, "Your case is good and right, but there is no one from the king who will listen to you." And then he says, "If only I were the judge in the land. Everyone with a dispute could come to me, and I would give them justice." He is positioning himself as the king. David is not accessible, attentive, hearing the people. The text says in verse 6 that whenever anyone came near to bow down before him, Absalom would reach out and take hold of them and kiss them. He is physically warm, personally present, populist in his instincts. And the hearts of the men of Israel turn toward him, the text says. 4 years of this, 4 years of quietly, patiently, deliberately stealing the loyalty of the people. And then Absalom goes to Hebron, the city where David's own kingship began, and there he is proclaimed king. And a conspiracy grows suddenly strong, with many people joining him. The news comes to David in Jerusalem. The hearts of the men of Israel are with Absalom. And David's response is immediate. He decides to flee. He says in 2 Samuel chapter 15, verse 14, "Come, let us flee, or none of us will escape from Absalom. Let us leave quickly, or he will move quickly to overtake us and bring ruin on us and put the city to the sword." What follows is one of the most remarkable images in the entire David narrative. A king leaving his own capital on foot, barefoot, weeping with his head covered. The people with him are weeping too. He crosses the Kidron Valley and goes out toward the wilderness, the same wilderness where he hid from Saul, now the refuge again when his own son has risen against him. His supporters come with him, his household, his servants, his loyal soldiers, in the 600 men who had been with him since the wilderness years. The ark is brought out too, but David sends it back. He says to the priests in verse 25, "If I find favor in the Lord's eyes, he will bring me back and let me see it and his dwelling place again. But if he says, 'I am not pleased with you,' then I am ready. Let him do to me whatever seems good to him." This is not despair. It is a kind of radical submission, the same posture that refused to touch the Lord's anointed in the cave and on the hilltop, now applied to his own situation. I am in God's hands. Let him do what he will. Absalom enters Jerusalem, and on the advice of a counselor named Ahithophel, publicly takes the concubines David has left behind. This act on the roof of the palace, visible to all Israel, is the fulfillment of Nathan's words from years before. "I will do this thing before all Israel and before the sun." The private sin is answered by public exposure. What David did in the darkness is answered by what his son does in daylight. The ancient writer traces this connection without spelling it out. The reader is expected to remember 2 Samuel chapter 12 and feel the weight of the echo. Meanwhile, David's loyal counselor Hushai, who is secretly working to undermine Absalom's plans, gives advice that delays Absalom's military response long enough for David to prepare and regroup across the Jordan. When the battle finally comes, fought in the forest of Ephraim in 2 Samuel chapter 18, it goes decisively in David's favor. But David's command before the battle is specific and emphatic. He says in verse 5 to Joab and the other commanders, "Deal gently for my sake with the young man Absalom." He says it in front of all the army. He wants his son brought back alive. Absalom's death comes not through enemy attack, but through an accident that the text describes with a particular kind of tragic irony. Absalom is riding on his mule under the thick branches of a great oak tree, and his head catches in the tree, and the mule goes out from under him, and he is left hanging between heaven and earth. A soldier finds him there and reports to Joab without touching Absalom, because he heard the king's orders. Joab takes 3 javelins and plunges them into Absalom's heart while he is still alive in the oak tree, and 10 of Joab's armor-bearers finish the work. The man who began his revenge with patience and ended it with fire dies hanging between the earth and the sky, killed by the general his father could never fully control. David's grief when the news comes is complete and unconcealed. He goes up to the chamber over the gate and weeps. And as he goes, he says these words from 2 Samuel chapter 19, verse 4. "O my son Absalom, my son Absalom, would I had died instead of you, O Absalom, my son, my son." It is one of the most raw expressions of parental grief in all of ancient literature. A king who would have given everything to trade places with the son who tried to kill him. What I want to reflect on as we think about the theological shape of this chapter is something that Robert Alter has written about with great sensitivity in his commentary on the David story. The Absalom narrative, he argues, is not primarily about politics or military strategy. It is about what children inherit from their parents, not just property and position, but patterns. Amnon's entitlement, Absalom's rage, the justice that was never delivered for Tamar. These are all connected to the moral atmosphere of David's household, to a father who was capable of great love and great failure simultaneously. The sword that Nathan promised has found its way into the family's own hands and hearts. And David, sitting in grief over his dead son, is receiving the full account of what his choices cost. He wanted to die in Absalom's place. He could not. What he can do, and what the text will show him doing in the chapters that follow, however imperfectly, is go on. Return to Jerusalem. Receive the people. Rule again. Carry the grief and the love together, as they always seem to travel in this life, inseparable and real. As we come to the close of this chapter, I want you to rest with the image of David crossing back over the Jordan, returning to the city he fled, weeping and barefoot. The rebellion is over. Absalom is dead. The kingdom is restored, though the scars of what happened will not easily fade. David is older now, visibly, in ways that go deeper than years. He has been a shepherd boy, and a warrior, and a king, and a fugitive, and a sinner, and a penitent. And now he is a grieving father, making his way back to a throne he held and lost and is being handed back. In our final chapter of this documentary, I want to walk with you into the last days of David's life, to his final words, his charge to Solomon, his death, and then stand back and try to see the whole shape of a life that has been described, analyzed, prayed over, and debated for 3,000 years. We will ask what David's legacy actually is, and why, across all of Jewish, Christian, and Islamic tradition, his name refuses to stop meaning something.